Welcome back to the Park Keeper's Stories, where the wilderness holds secrets darker than the night itself. I'm your guide through America's most haunting folklore and the terrifying encounters that park rangers dare not speak of. I never thought I'd end up in the heart of Alaska's wilderness. Growing up in the suburbs, my connection to nature was limited to weekend hikes and summer camping trips, but something about the raw, untamed vastness of Alaska had always pulled at me, like an ancient voice calling from the depths of primordial forests. When the position opened at Denali National Park, I applied without hesitation. 6 months later, I found myself driving up the single road that penetrated the 6 million acres of wild terrain, watching the mountains rise before me like giants awakening from slumber. "You chose a hell of a post," said Ross, the gray-bearded veteran ranger who was showing me around. Anaku Station is about as remote as it gets, 20 miles to the nearest ranger post, 60 to anything resembling civilization. The cabin stood beside a mirror-still lake, surrounded by dense spruce forest that climbed the nearby hills before giving way to the tundra and the distant snow-capped peaks. It was early June, but the air still carried a bite that reminded me winter was never far away in these parts. "Previous ranger couldn't hack it," Ross continued, as he helped me unload my gear. "Said the isolation got to him, started hearing things in the woods at night." I laughed nervously. "What kind of things?" Ross shrugged. "People get strange out here alone. The wilderness plays tricks on your mind when you've got nothing but your thoughts for company." The cabin was sturdy and well-equipped. A main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a bedroom, and an office space filled with maps, radios, and weather monitoring equipment. Solar panels and a backup generator provided power, and a satellite phone offered my only reliable connection to the outside world. "Your main job is monitoring wildlife, assisting any hikers who make it this far out, and keeping an eye on environmental conditions," Ross explained. "Search and rescue when needed, though that's rare out here. Most tourists stick to the main areas of the park." As Ross prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "One more thing. The locals, the few Athabascan elders who still live traditionally about 30 miles northeast, they call this area Nakani Tun, means the wanderer's territory. They don't come here if they can help it." "Why's that?" I asked. "Old stories," Ross said with a dismissive wave. "Every culture has them. Just respect the land and you'll be fine." After Ross left, I spent the evening organizing my supplies and familiarizing myself with the equipment. As darkness fell, I stepped onto the porch and gazed across the lake. The water reflected the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky, and the silence was absolute. Then, from somewhere in the distant forest, came a sound, something between a howl and a deep, resonant call that echoed off the mountains. I told myself it was a wolf, though it sounded unlike any wolf I'd heard before. That night I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with shadows moving through trees and the sensation of being watched. My first weeks at Anaku Station fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings were spent checking weather instruments and wildlife cameras, followed by patrol hikes along designated routes. I cataloged plant species, tracked animal movements, and documented everything in detailed reports transmitted back to headquarters. The isolation didn't bother me as much as I'd anticipated. There was a peace in the solitude, a chance to hear my own thoughts clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. The forest became my companion, its moods and rhythms familiar. It was during my third week that I found the first unusual track. I was hiking along the eastern shore of the lake when I noticed an impression in the mud near the water's edge. It resembled a human footprint, but was nearly 17 inches long and disproportionately wide. The toes were splayed, and there was a distinct arch. My first thought was that it must be a bear track, distorted by rain or melting snow. But studying it closer, I couldn't make it fit any known wildlife pattern I'd been trained to identify. I photographed it from multiple angles, took measurements, and made a plaster cast to send back to headquarters. That night, I consulted the station's field guides, but found nothing that matched what I'd seen. I entered the data in my report, attaching the photos with a note requesting identification assistance. 3 days later, I received a terse reply. Likely degraded bear track or hoax. No further investigation required. I should have let it go. But something about the dismissal bothered me. I'd been around bear tracks my entire career, and this was different. The next morning, I hiked back to the location, only to find that heavy rain had washed away any remaining evidence. As I stood there, a sensation crept over me, a prickling awareness of being observed. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. Still, the feeling persisted as I made my way back to the cabin, causing me to repeatedly glance over my shoulder. That evening, while I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and pink, the radio crackled to life. Anaku Station, this is dispatch. We have a report of hikers overdue from the Calcin Ridge Trail. Last check-in was 3 days ago near your sector. Any sightings? I hadn't seen anyone in weeks. Negative dispatch. No hikers in my area. Details on the missing party? 2 men, mid-30s, experienced backpackers on a 10-day trek. They should have checked in at Toklat River Station yesterday. I'll begin search patterns at first light, I promised. That night, the strange howling came again, closer this time. It started as a low moan that built to a bellowing cry, echoing across the lake. I stood at the window, straining to see through the darkness, when a movement caught my eye. A large shadow passing between trees at the forest's edge. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, stepping cautiously onto the porch. The beam cut through the darkness but revealed nothing except the gently swaying branches. The howling had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my ears. As I turned to go back inside, my light swept across the ground near the cabin steps. There, pressed into the soft earth, was another footprint, identical to the one I'd found by the lake, but fresher, more defined. And it was headed toward the cabin. Dawn broke with a heavy mist hanging over the lake, transforming the landscape into something ethereal and unfamiliar. I prepared my search gear methodically: GPS, first aid kit, extra water, emergency rations, and my service rifle. The weight of responsibility settled on me as I plotted the most likely routes the missing hikers might have taken. The Calcin Ridge Trail was 15 miles northwest of my position, a challenging route that wound through dense forest before climbing above the tree line. If the hikers had strayed from the path or attempted a shortcut, they could easily have ended up in my sector. I radioed my search plan to dispatch before heading out, the coordinates of my intended search grid precisely noted. The morning air was sharp in my lungs as I set off, alert for any sign of human passage. Hours passed as I methodically swept through my designated area, calling out periodically and listening for any response. The forest was unusually quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. Near midday, I reached a small clearing where a stream cut through the forest floor, and there, half hidden in the tall grass, I found a backpack. My pulse quickened as I approached. The pack was high quality, the kind serious backpackers use, and it had been torn open, its contents scattered. I photographed everything before examining the scene more closely. The damage to the pack didn't match bear or wolf patterns. It looked as if it had been ripped apart by powerful hands rather than claws or teeth. Among the scattered items, I found a wallet with ID. Michael Terrence, 34, from Anchorage. One of our missing hikers. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, this is Anaku. I've located gear belonging to one of the missing hikers. Signs of wildlife interference. No visual on individuals yet. After marking the location, I widened my search pattern. 30 yards further, I found a tent site. The tent half erected, sleeping bags unrolled inside. A cooking stove was still set up, a pot of water now dry on its burner. It appeared they had been in the process of making camp when something happened. There was no blood, no signs of injury or struggle beyond the damaged backpack. It was as if they had simply walked away, leaving everything behind, or been taken. The thought sent a chill through me despite the afternoon warmth. I continued searching until the light began to fade, finding nothing more than a single boot print in mud near the stream. A human print, not the large, unusual tracks I'd found earlier. I marked all locations on my GPS and reluctantly headed back to the cabin, knowing that searching in darkness would be futile and dangerous. The return journey felt longer, the forest shadows deeper, Twice I stopped, certain I heard movement paralleling my path just beyond visual range. Each time I called out, only silence answered. When the cabin finally came into view, relief washed over me. I hurried inside, securing the door behind me before radioing a complete report to dispatch. A search and rescue team would be helicoptered in at first light to continue the effort with more personnel. "Any theories on what happened?" the dispatcher asked. I hesitated, thinking of the torn backpack, the abandoned camp, the strange tracks I'd found days earlier. "Nothing concrete," I replied, "but something doesn't feel right." After signing off, I heated a simple meal and tried to relax. My muscles ached from the day's exertion, but my mind remained alert, processing everything I'd seen. I was almost dozing when a sharp crack jolted me awake, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under significant weight, very close to the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and moved cautiously to the window. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. Then, just at the edge of the light's reach, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large, upright, retreating into the darkness. Heart pounding, I retrieved my rifle and moved to the door, debating whether to investigate further. Professional duty warred with primal instinct, the latter screaming at me to stay inside, to keep barriers between myself and whatever lurked in the forest. Another sound decided me, a low, rumbling growl unlike anything I'd ever heard from wolf or bear. I secured the door's deadbolt and methodically checked every window, making sure each was locked. Sleep was impossible. I sat with my back to the wall, rifle across my lap, listening to the night sounds outside. Occasionally branches would crack or leaves would rustle, always just at the edge of the clearing surrounding the cabin. Whatever it was, it seemed to be circling, testing boundaries. Near dawn, exhaustion finally claimed me, and I dozed fitfully. I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the distant thrum of an approaching helicopter. The search team had arrived. 4 rangers and a wilderness paramedic comprised the team. Their leader, Hayes, was a stocky man with 20 years of Alaska experience etched into his weathered face. "Heard you found some interesting signs yesterday," he said after introductions were complete. I briefed them on everything I'd discovered, leading them to the map where I'd marked the significant locations. "What about these tracks you reported last week?" Hayes asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Find any more of those?" I described the fresh print I'd found near the cabin and the shadowy figure I'd glimpsed in the night. Hayes and the others exchanged looks I couldn't quite interpret. "We'll split into 2 teams, Hayes finally said. "You and Carver head back to where you found the backpack. The rest of us will work the area to the north. Radio check every 30 minutes. Carver was the youngest of the team, a female ranger with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. As we hiked, she asked pointed questions about my time at the station, particularly about the strange tracks and sounds. "You know something," I said finally. "Something you're not telling me." Carver was silent for several steps before responding. "There have been incidents in this region before. Hikers gone missing, strange reports from people who come out of the backcountry. Most get written off as inexperience, exposure, wildlife encounters. But," I prompted when she didn't continue, "but some of us who've been around a while, we've seen things that don't add up. Hayes has a collection of plaster casts similar to what you described. Footprints too big for any known animal, too structured to be anything but bipedal." We reached the backpack location and began a more thorough search of the area. 2 hours in, Carver called me over to what looked like a game trail leading deeper into the forest. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a broken branch about 7 feet off the ground. Whatever broke this was tall, and here, she indicated scuff marks in the dirt. Something heavy passed through recently. We followed the trail for nearly a mile before it opened onto a rock field. And there, clear as day in a patch of mud, was a line of tracks. The same oversized humanoid footprints I'd found by the lake. Only these were fresher, more defined. Carver photographed them silently, her expression grim. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight. "We should head back, report this to Hayes." But as we turned to retrace our steps, the radio crackled with Hayes' urgent voice. "All units return to base immediately. Weather system moving in fast. Helicopter extraction in 30 minutes. Looking up, I could see dark clouds gathering over the mountains, advancing quickly. In Alaska, weather changed with deadly speed, and being caught in a storm in the backcountry was a risk no ranger took lightly. We double-timed it back, the first fat raindrops beginning to fall as the cabin came into view. The helicopter was already there, rotors spinning, the pilot gesturing urgently for us to hurry. "What about the missing hikers?" I shouted to Hayes over the roar of the engine. "Search suspended until weather clears," he shouted back. "You're coming out with us." I hesitated, looking back at the cabin. "My post, director's orders. No one stays out here alone until we know what's going on." The storm hit in earnest as we lifted off, the helicopter bucking in the violent wind. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched my cabin grow smaller below us, a lone outpost in the vastness of the wilderness. And just before the clouds obscured my view completely, I saw something emerge from the tree line near the cabin, a large, dark figure standing upright watching our departure. The debriefing at park headquarters was tense. Hayes, the senior rangers, and the park director listened to my report, with expressions that shifted between skepticism and concern. I presented the photographs, the measurements, my daily logs, all laid out in meticulous detail. "And you're certain these tracks don't match any known wildlife pattern?" the director asked. A thin man named Lawson, whose desk job had softened what had once been a ranger's physique. "Absolutely certain," I replied. "I've worked with bear, moose, and wolf tracks extensively. These are bipedal, structured like a human foot but much larger, and with anatomical differences." Lawson exchanged glances with Hayes. "And the missing hikers? No sign of them beyond the abandoned camp?" "None that we found before the weather forced evacuation. The search needs to continue as soon as possible." Lawson nodded slowly. "We have other teams out, approaching from different sectors, but I'm not sending anyone back to Anaku Station until we have a better understanding of what we're dealing with." After the meeting, Hayes pulled me aside. "There's someone you should talk to," he said quietly. "Not officially, you understand. But she might have insights about what you've experienced." That's how I found myself driving through the small town of Healy, following Hayes's directions to a modest house on the outskirts. An elderly native Alaskan woman answered the door, her face deeply lined, but her eyes sharp and alert. "This is Nora Ishnuk," Hayes introduced us, elder of the Koyukon Athabaskan people. "Nora, this is the ranger I told you about, stationed at Anaktuvuk." Nora nodded slowly, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Come in," she finally said. "We have much to discuss." Inside, the house was warm and filled with traditional crafts, beadwork, carved wooden masks, and woven baskets. Nora served us tea in silence before settling into an armchair across from us. "Tell me exactly what you saw," she said without preamble. "Everything, even what seems impossible." I recounted my experiences, the tracks, the sounds in the night, the shadowy figure by the tree line, the abandoned camp of the missing hikers. Nora listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, she sighed deeply. "The Nakani," she said simply. "What your people call Bigfoot." Despite myself, I felt a flicker of disappointment. I'd hoped for a more concrete explanation than local folklore. Sensing my reaction, Nora leaned forward. "You think this is just stories? The Nakani have been known to my people since before the Russians came. We have always shared these lands with them, keeping our distance, respecting boundaries." "If they're real," I asked, "why isn't there conclusive evidence? In an age of cameras and scientific research—" "They are intelligent," Nora cut me off. "More intelligent than most give them credit for. They know how to avoid human detection, living in the most remote areas, moving primarily at night, and those who do encounter them often don't return to tell their stories." Hayes shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Nora, what about the missing hikers? If these creatures were involved, what might have happened?" Nora's expression darkened. "The Nakani are territorial, especially in certain seasons. They leave warnings, signs that humans should stay away. If those warnings are ignored—" "What signs?" I asked, thinking of the tracks I'd found weeks before the hikers went missing. "Markers. Broken branches placed in specific patterns, rocks stacked in unnatural ways, footprints left where they will be found." vocalizations that carry for miles through the mountains. A chill ran through me as I remembered the strange howling I'd heard on multiple nights. Those hikers, Nora continued, they entered territory that was marked as forbidden. If they were taken, it was because they crossed boundaries they should have respected. Taken where? I pressed. Nora shook her head. There are places in the deep forest where even our hunters will not go. Caves in the high mountains. Valleys hidden between peaks that don't appear on any map. I wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, yet I couldn't explain away what I'd seen with my own eyes. How do I protect myself if I go back to the station? You're considering going back? Hayes asked, surprised. Those hikers might still be alive, I said, and it's my post. I can't abandon it based on folklore, no matter how unsettling. Nora studied me for a long moment. The old ones taught us to leave offerings at the boundaries of their territory. Not food or objects, but songs. Sounds carry meaning to the Nakani. If you must return, show respect through your voice. Let them know you acknowledge their presence and their right to the land. It sounded absurd, singing to appease forest creatures straight out of cryptozoology textbooks. Yet something in Nora's certainty gave me pause. There is one more thing, she said, rising and moving to an old cedar chest in the corner. From it, she withdrew a small pouch made of worn leather. This contains kinnikinnick, sacred herbs. If you burn a small amount each evening, the smoke will create a boundary they rarely cross. I accepted the pouch, more out of respect for her beliefs than any conviction it would help. Thank you. As we prepared to leave, Nora gripped my arm with surprising strength. The Nakani have lived alongside us for thousands of years. They are not evil, but they are powerful and protective of what is theirs. If you return, remember, you are the visitor in their home. The drive back to headquarters was quiet, both Hayes and I lost in our own thoughts. You don't really believe all that, do you? I finally asked him. Hayes kept his eyes on the road. 22 years ago, my first season as a ranger, I was posted even more remote than you, Adigan Pass, up by the Brooks Range. One night something tried to get into my cabin, something strong enough to nearly tear the door off its hinges. He paused, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I fired a warning shot through the window. There was a scream, not animal, not fully human either. Next morning I found blood on the steps. A lot of blood. I followed the trail for about 100 yards before it disappeared at the river. Did you report it? Of course, a wildlife officer came out, took samples of the blood. The results came back inconclusive. Primate blood, but not matching any known species. The report was filed away and forgotten. We drove in silence for several more miles. I'm going back to Anaku, I said finally. Those hikers might still be out there. Hayes nodded slowly. I figured you would. But you won't be going alone. I've requested temporary reassignment to your station. Director approved it this morning. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by determination. With two of us at the station, we could conduct a more thorough search and maintain better security at night. We fly back tomorrow, weather permitting, Hayes continued. Pack heavy. No telling how long we'll be out there. That night, alone in my quarters at headquarters, I researched everything I could find about Bigfoot encounters in Alaska. Most accounts were easily dismissible. Tourist exaggerations, obvious hoaxes, or misidentifications of known wildlife. But there were others, detailed reports from experienced outdoorsmen, Forest Service personnel, and indigenous hunters that couldn't be so easily explained away. Patterns emerged, the territorial behavior, the warning signs, the vocalizations, all matching what I'd experienced and what Nora had described. As I finally drifted toward sleep, a new thought formed. What if the missing hikers hadn't been taken against their will? What if they had followed the tracks, just as I had been tempted to do, drawn deeper into the wilderness by curiosity and the tantalizing possibility of documenting something extraordinary? And if so, what had they found? The helicopter touched down near my cabin the following afternoon. The storm had passed, leaving behind crystalline air that made the distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Hayes and I unloaded our gear efficiently, both of us scanning the tree line as we worked. The cabin appeared undisturbed, exactly as I'd left it. Still, Hayes insisted we check every room, every cabinet, and the perimeter before settling in. Nothing was amiss, but the feeling of being watched returned as soon as we stepped outside. "We'll begin the search at first light," Hayes said as we prepared a simple dinner. "Focus on the area where the hikers' camp was found, then expand outward in a spiral pattern." I nodded, trying to focus on practical matters, rather than the memory of that dark figure I'd glimpsed watching the helicopter depart days earlier. "I've marked all the locations where I found unusual tracks. We should check those areas for fresh sign as well." After dinner, as darkness gathered outside, I remembered Nora's gift. Feeling slightly foolish, I opened the leather pouch and sprinkled a small amount of the dried herbs into a metal bowl. The pungent aroma filled the cabin as it smoldered. Hayes raised an eyebrow but made no comment, busying himself with checking our equipment for the next day's search. We established a watch schedule for the night, 4 hours on, 4 off. I took the first shift, sitting by the window with the lights dimmed, watching the moonlight create silver patterns on the lake's surface. For the first 2 hours, nothing moved except the occasional breeze through the trees. Then, just after midnight, I heard it, the same haunting call that had awakened me on previous nights. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a mournful cry that echoed across the water. I woke Hayes with a hand on his shoulder, pressing a finger to my lips. We listened together as the call came again, closer this time. Vocal range too wide for a wolf, Hayes whispered. Not a bear either. "Nakani?" I asked, the word feeling strange on my tongue. Hayes just shook his head, not in denial but in uncertainty. We remained still, listening as the calls continued, seeming to circle the cabin at a distance. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more unnerving than the sounds had been. Just before dawn during Hayes's watch, the radio crackled to life, the first communication we'd received since arriving. "Anaku Station, this is dispatch. Report status, over." Hayes responded immediately. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Hayes at Anaku, all secure. Preparing to begin search operations at daybreak. Be advised, we have new information on missing hikers. Satellite phone ping received approximately 6 miles northeast of your position. Bearing 058. Signal was brief, no voice communication established." We looked at each other. 6 miles northeast would place the signal deep in the roadless backcountry, in an area of dense forest and rugged terrain that was rarely traversed even by the most adventurous hikers. "Acknowledged, dispatch. We'll adjust search pattern to investigate the signal source." As the sky lightened, we gathered our gear and studied the maps. The area where the signal had originated was marked only with contour lines and the vague notation, "mixed forest." No trails, no landmarks, nothing to indicate why anyone would venture there. "It makes no sense," I said, tracing the likely route from the hikers' abandoned camp to the signal location. "Why would they head deeper into the wilderness instead of toward a ranger station or the park road?" Hayes had no answer, but his expression was grim as he checked his rifle and secured extra ammunition in his pack. We set out as the first rays of sunlight touched the mountains, moving at a steady pace through terrain that grew increasingly difficult. By midday, we had covered nearly 3 miles, the forest around us becoming denser, the undergrowth more tangled. "Look at this," Hayes called, kneeling beside a fallen tree. A strip of fabric, blue nylon, the kind used in high-end hiking jackets, was caught on a broken branch. "Recent, the color hasn't faded." Encouraged by this sign, we pressed on. The forest changed subtly as we progressed, the trees older, larger, with dense canopies that created a perpetual twilight below. Moss covered everything, muffling our footsteps and creating an eerie silence broken only by our breathing. Near what we estimated was the 5-mile mark, we found more evidence. A single hiking boot, its laces neatly tied, sitting in the middle of a small clearing as if placed there deliberately. "This isn't right," I murmured, inspecting the boot. It showed no damage, no signs of being forcibly removed. "It's like he just stepped out of it and continued on." Hayes nodded, his face tense. "Like breadcrumbs. But leading where? And why?" We continued forward with increased caution, both of us now moving with weapons ready. The GPS indicated we were approaching the coordinates where the satellite phone signal had been detected. The forest opened suddenly into a clearing dominated by a massive, wind-twisted spruce. At its base, partially hidden by exposed roots, was the entrance to what appeared to be a natural cave or crevice in the rocky soil. And there, propped against the tree trunk, was a satellite phone. Hayes approached it carefully while I covered him, scanning the surrounding forest. The phone was intact, its battery still showing half charge. Hayes pressed a button and the screen illuminated. "Last outgoing call attempt was 3 days ago," he reported. "Duration 9 seconds, not long enough to establish voice communication." "Why leave it here?" I wondered aloud. "And where are they?" Hayes didn't answer, his attention fixed on something at the base of the tree. He crouched, pushing aside fallen needles to reveal marks carved into the trunk, 3 parallel lines intersected by a fourth, forming a symbol I didn't recognize. "I've seen this before," Hayes said quietly. "In the Brooks Range. The old hunters called it a boundary marker." A sound from the forest edge made us both turn sharply, a deliberate breaking of a branch like a warning. "We're being watched," I whispered, scanning the shadows between the trees. Hayes nodded almost imperceptibly, slowly rising to his feet. "We need to make a decision. Continue toward that cave or head back before we lose daylight." The rational choice was clear. 2 rangers, minimal backup, an unknown situation with potential danger. Protocol dictated we retreat, report our findings, and return with a larger, better-equipped team. Yet something held me there. The satellite phone placed so deliberately, the strange symbol, the sense that the missing hikers had been drawn here just as we had been. If they had entered that dark opening, what had they found? "We can't leave without knowing," I said finally, "but we should document everything first in case—" I let the sentence hang unfinished. Hayes didn't argue. We photographed the scene methodically, the phone, the symbol, the cave entrance, and recorded our coordinates with redundant devices. Hayes made a brief radio call to dispatch, reporting our location and findings. "Be advised, we are investigating a potential shelter location. We'll report again in 30 minutes. The cave entrance was larger than it had first appeared, easily big enough for a person to enter while crouching. A cool draft flowed from its depths, carrying a musty, unfamiliar scent. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a rough tunnel that descended at a gentle angle. The walls showed signs of both natural formation and deliberate modification. Sections had been widened or smoothed by tools. "Someone's been maintaining this," Hayes observed, running his hand along a suspiciously even section of wall. We proceeded cautiously, backs slightly hunched in the confined space. The tunnel widened after about 30 feet, opening into a larger chamber where we could finally stand upright. My flashlight beam revealed a space about 20 feet across, the ceiling supported by natural rock columns. The floor had been deliberately cleared and flattened, but it was the walls that captured our attention. They were covered with paintings. Red ochre and black charcoal depicted stylized human figures, animals, and strange, elongated forms that resembled upright creatures with disproportionately long arms. Interspersed among these were handprints, some human-sized, others much larger. "This is incredible," I breathed, moving closer to examine the artistry. "These could be ancient." "Or made to look ancient," Hayes cautioned, though his voice held a note of awe. "Either way, this place is important to someone." A narrow passage led deeper from the main chamber. Without discussing it, we both knew we needed to continue. The passage twisted and descended further, the air growing noticeably cooler. After what seemed like 100 yards of careful progress, it opened into a second, larger chamber. And there, illuminated in our flashlight beams, we found the missing hikers' equipment, backpacks, sleeping bags, cooking gear, all arranged neatly along one wall. A small LED lantern still glowed faintly, its battery nearly exhausted. "They were here," Hayes said unnecessarily, willingly by the look of it. "This is set up like a camp, not like prisoners." I moved further into the chamber, my light catching the gleam of something reflective in a far corner. A notebook, expensive, waterproof, the kind serious field researchers use. I opened it carefully. The pages contained meticulous notes, drawings, and coordinates. The handwriting started neat and ordered, but became increasingly erratic in later entries. "Listen to this," I said, reading aloud from one of the final entries. Day 7. We've been accepted. The sentinels still watch from a distance, but they no longer display threat behaviors when we approach. M believes we'll be taken to the colony soon. The vocalizations change tonight. Higher pitch, more complex patterns. They're communicating something specific about us, no longer fearful for our safety. This discovery will change everything we thought we knew. Hayes took the notebook from me, flipping through the earlier pages. These guys weren't just hikers, he said grimly. They came looking for the Nakani, deliberately. A sudden draft extinguished our lantern, plunging us into darkness broken only by our flashlights. And with the darkness came a sound, a low, rumbling growl from the tunnel behind us, followed by the unmistakable cadence of heavy footsteps approaching. The footsteps halted at the chamber entrance. Hayes and I backed against the far wall, both operating on Ranger survival instinct, as we positioned our flashlights to illuminate the passage while keeping our peripheral vision clear of the beams. The growl came again, lower this time, almost subsonic. The vibration of it felt as much as heard. Then, slowly, something began to emerge from the tunnel into the chamber. First came a massive hand, not a paw, but a hand with opposable thumbs and defined fingers covered in dark hair. It gripped the edge of the rock entrance, the muscles beneath the hair rippling with controlled strength. I had expected fear, but what washed over me instead was a profound sense of awareness, the certainty that I stood at a threshold few humans had ever crossed. Hayes must have felt it too, for neither of us raised our weapons. We stood frozen as a figure ducked through the entrance and rose to its full height before us. 8 feet tall, perhaps more, with powerful shoulders and a barrel chest, covered in dark brown hair that hung longer around a face that was both alien and eerily familiar. The brow ridge was prominent, the jaw robust, but the eyes were unmistakably intelligent, studying us with an intensity that made it clear we were being evaluated. Behind it came a second figure, slightly smaller but moving with the same fluid grace that belied its size. This one carried something, a bundle wrapped in what looked like hand-processed leather. The larger being made a series of sounds, clicks, deep resonant tones, and what could only be described as words in a language I'd never heard, but which contained distinct patterns and repetitions. "They're talking," Hayes whispered beside me, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. The smaller figure stepped forward, placing the bundle on the ground between us. With deliberate movements, it unwrapped the leather to reveal a human artifact. A digital camera, the same high-end model I'd seen listed in the missing hiker's equipment inventory. The larger being made another series of sounds, then pointed to the camera, to us, and finally toward a side passage we hadn't noticed before, a smaller tunnel leading deeper into the earth. The meaning seemed clear, even without shared language. They were showing us something, offering evidence. Moving slowly, telegraphing my actions, I stepped forward and picked up the camera. It powered on, the battery still holding charge. The display showed it contained 342 images. I began to scroll through them, Hayes moving cautiously to look over my shoulder. The first images were typical hiking photographs, landscapes, trail markers, wildlife. Then they changed, becoming more focused, more deliberate. Distant figures at the edge of clearings, dark shapes moving between trees, footprints identical to those I'd found by the lake. The progression was clear. The hikers had started following the signs, documenting their investigation. The later images were extraordinary, closer views of the beings now standing before us, clearly taken with long telephoto lenses from concealed positions. The final sequence showed a settlement of sorts, structures built into hillsides and among massive trees, partially concealed by the forest but revealing a complex community. As we viewed the images, the larger being watched our reactions carefully. When we reached the end of the sequence, it made another series of sounds and gestured again toward the side passage. "I think they want to show us where the hikers are," I said quietly. Hayes nodded, his professional training warring visibly with the unprecedented situation. "This is beyond anything in the manual," he murmured, "but I don't sense threat." We followed as the two beings led us through the narrow passage, which wound deeper before beginning a gradual ascent. After perhaps 10 minutes of careful progress, We felt fresh air flowing from ahead. The tunnel widened and suddenly we emerged, not into another cave, but onto a ledge overlooking a hidden valley, nestled between steep mountain walls. Below us, a community spread across several acres of forest clearing, structures that blended almost seamlessly with the landscape, some built into living trees, others formed from intricately arranged stone and timber, housed what appeared to be dozens of the beings. They moved about the settlement with purpose, carrying out tasks, interacting in what was clearly a complex social structure. And there, near the center of the community, was a structure different from the others, more deliberately constructed, with a door-like opening and what might have been windows covered with translucent material. Outside, it stood two human figures, the missing hikers. Even from this distance, it was clear they were unrestrained, moving freely, engaged in what appeared to be communication with several of the beings. One held a notebook, probably the companion to the one we'd found, and was making notes or drawings as the other operated what looked like a small recording device. "They're not captives," Hayes said, his voice a mixture of relief and confusion. "They're researchers." The larger being that had led us here made a descending series of vocalizations that somehow conveyed both affirmation and warning. It pointed to the hikers, then to us, then swept its arm across the valley in a gesture that encompassed the entire community. Finally, it placed a massive hand over its chest and bowed its head slightly. The meaning seemed clear. "They are here by choice. You may join them or return. This place is ours, but we are sharing it." Hayes and I exchanged glances, years of ranger training and wilderness experience, providing no protocol for this situation. "We need to make contact with those hikers," Hayes said finally. "Confirm they're here willingly, that they're safe." I nodded, but hesitated before following our guides down the path toward the settlement. "Hayes," I said quietly, "if we go down there, this changes everything, not just for us but for them." I nodded toward the community below. "Once this becomes known—" "Who says it becomes known?" Hayes interrupted, his expression deadly serious. "You saw what those hikers found. They didn't stumble on this place. They were searching for it specifically, and they chose to stay." "You're suggesting we what?" "Don't report this. That's against every regulation. I'm suggesting we gather all the facts before making decisions that can't be unmade," Hayes replied. "These beings have existed alongside us for who knows how long, deliberately staying hidden. There must be a reason." As we debated, the smaller being that had accompanied us made a sound of impatience and gestured again toward the path. The decision couldn't be delayed. I thought of Nora's words about respecting boundaries, about the long history of coexistence based on mutual distance. I thought of what would happen if this valley were to appear on official reports. The researchers, the media, the inevitable disruption of a community that had clearly gone to great lengths to remain separate from human society. "We talked to the hikers," I said finally. "We confirm they're safe and here by choice. Then we decide." The path down to the settlement was well maintained, with steps carved into steeper sections. As we descended, more of the beings became aware of our presence. Some retreated into structures, while others moved closer, curiosity overcoming caution. The hikers spotted us when we were about halfway down. One, a tall man with a red beard who matched the ID photo of Michael Terrence, raised his hand in greeting but made no move to approach us. His companion, a shorter man with close-cropped dark hair, watched our approach with visible apprehension. When we finally stood face to face, Terrence spoke first, his voice rough from disuse of English. "Rangers, we figured someone would come eventually." "You've been reported missing," Hayes said. "Your families are worried." Terrence nodded, guilt flickering across his features. "That wasn't the plan. We were supposed to complete our expedition and return with enough evidence to be taken seriously, but—" He gestured at the settlement around us. "Once we found this, everything changed." "You came looking for them specifically," I said, not a question. "We've been tracking evidence for years," the second man said. "Footprints, hair samples, sound recordings. We knew they were real, but we never imagined." He trailed off, looking around with undisguised wonder. "Are you being held against your will?" Hayes asked, direct and professional. Both men laughed, the sound startling after the tension of our journey. Far from it, Terence said. They could have eliminated us a dozen times. Instead, they watched us, evaluated us, and eventually brought us here. They're a complex society, the second man added. Their language has syntax and grammar. They use tools, maintain agricultural plots further up the valley. They're intelligent, not human, but... He struggled for words. People, in every meaningful sense. And you decided to stay, I prompted. Terence nodded. Temporarily. They've allowed us to document their community, their habits, their language, knowledge that's been sought for centuries, but with strict conditions. No location data can leave the valley, the second man continued. No photographs that could lead others here. They understand the threat exposure would bring. Hayes looked at me, the question in his eyes matching my own thoughts. So what happens now? He asked the hikers. Your families, your lives back home, you've just abandoned them? Terence's expression sobered. We plan to return next week. Take what we've learned, but protect this place. Publish enough to prove their existence without endangering them. And you think that's possible? I asked skeptically. Once the world knows they're real, every expedition, every corporation, every government agency will be looking. That's why we need your help, the second man said quietly. As rangers, your reports will carry weight. You can help shape the narrative, establish protective protocols. Around us, the community continued its activities, the beings occasionally glancing our way but otherwise unperturbed by our presence. I noticed smaller figures, juveniles perhaps, watching curiously from doorways, evidence of a thriving population. We need to discuss this, Hayes said finally. Alone. The hikers nodded understanding, and we moved a short distance away, both of us overwhelmed by the implications of what we discovered. If we report this fully, I said quietly, this place will be overrun within weeks. Study teams, media, thrill seekers. There's no way to keep it contained. Hayes nodded grimly. And if we don't report it, we're violating our oaths as rangers, risking our careers, possibly breaking laws. We stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on us. Around us, the hidden valley continued its ancient rhythms, a parallel world that had existed alongside our own, unknown, undisturbed. There's a third option, I said finally. We report finding the hikers alive and well. We state they were conducting research but got disoriented in the backcountry. Technical truth, omitting the critical details. And this place? Hayes gestured at the settlement. Remains their secret to keep, I replied. At least until humanity is ready to make contact without destroying what we discover. Hayes was silent for a long moment, his ranger's integrity visibly wrestling with the unprecedented ethical dilemma. The hikers would have to agree to maintain the story, he said finally. I think they already understand the stakes, I replied. We returned to where Terence and his companion waited, the larger being that had first led us into the chamber standing nearby, observing our interaction with unnerving intelligence. We'll help you get back, I told the hikers. Report that you were conducting research, got disoriented, but survived on your own until we found you. No mention of... I gestured at the settlement. Relief washed over their faces. That's what we were hoping you'd say, Terence admitted. We need time to figure out how to share this discovery responsibly, if at all. We leave in the morning, Hayes said firmly. Your families deserve to know you're safe. As night fell over the valley, we were offered shelter in the structure that had been provided to the hikers. Around us, the community continued its life, sounds of their language, glimpses of their social interactions, evidence of a civilization that challenged everything we thought we knew about our place in the world. Before sleep claimed me, I stepped outside to look at the stars visible between the mountain peaks that had hidden this valley for perhaps thousands of years. The larger being, the one I'd come to think of as the leader, stood nearby, its own gaze turned skyward. Without thinking, I spoke to it directly. We'll keep your secret, I said, knowing it couldn't understand my words but hoping it might grasp my meaning. But others will come eventually. It's inevitable. The being turned to me, its eyes reflecting starlight. It made a series of sounds, different from before, almost musical in their cadence, and placed one massive hand gently on my shoulder before pointing to the mountains, then to its chest, and finally to me. I couldn't translate the specific meaning, but the sentiment seemed clear. We share this land. We have always been here. Now you know. As I returned to the shelter, I realized that while I had come to Alaska seeking wilderness and solitude, I had found something far more profound. A humbling reminder that humanity's understanding of the world remains incomplete, that mysteries still inhabit the wild places, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are those we choose to protect rather than exploit. In the morning, we would begin the journey back to my cabin, then to headquarters, carrying a secret that would both burden and enrich us for the rest of our lives. The official report would be simple: missing hikers found alive. The truth was anything but simple: a hidden valley, an ancient people, and the thin boundary between the known world and the wilderness that still harbors its deepest mysteries. As I drifted toward sleep, I heard the haunting call that had first drawn my attention weeks ago, but now, knowing its source, it no longer sounded alien or threatening. It was simply a voice in the night, calling across mountains that had witnessed the parallel journeys of two intelligent species, occasionally intersecting but largely separate, both finding their own way through the shadows of Denali. The faintest hint of dawn crept through the pines as I stepped onto the weathered porch of my cabin. Steam rose from my coffee mug, disappearing into the cool mountain air. Lake Nemeshin stretched before me, its surface perfectly still, mirroring the towering peaks that surrounded it like ancient guardians. This remote corner of the Cascade Wilderness had been my home for 3 seasons now, and I still hadn't grown tired of the view. My name is Kalitaka Rivers, Kale to most people who struggle with the pronunciation. The name means guardian of the people in Hopi, a weighty inheritance from my grandfather, who insisted I carry on the tradition, even though our bloodline had been diluted through generations of marriage outside the tribe. Sometimes I wondered if that name had somehow guided me to this life, to this isolated ranger station 26 miles from the nearest town. I took a long sip of coffee, savoring the bitter warmth as I contemplated the day ahead. Spring melt-off had finally subsided, and the summer hiking season would soon bring scattered groups of tourists to test themselves against the wilderness. For now, though, the forest belonged to me and the creatures that called it home. The radio crackled to life from inside the cabin. "Nemeshin Station, this is dispatch, come in." I sighed and walked back inside, setting my mug on the small table crowded with maps and logbooks. "Nemeshin Station receiving, go ahead dispatch," I answered, pressing the transmit button. "Morning, Kale. Just checking in. Any issues to report?" "All quiet here, dispatch. Trail assessment scheduled for today. Northwest passage up to Mirror Lake." "Copy that. We've got reports of some deadfall on that route after the storms last week. Might want to bring the chainsaw." "Already loaded in the UTV. Anything else?" "Yeah, you've got visitors coming. 2 researchers from the university scheduled to arrive tomorrow. They're doing some kind of habitat study. Official paperwork came through last night." I frowned. No one had mentioned visitors, especially this early in the season. "Copy that. I'll prepare the guest cabin. Nemeshin out." I placed the radio back in its charger and returned to the porch, my peaceful morning routine disrupted. The guest cabin hadn't been used since last fall. It would need cleaning and fresh supplies. The sun had finally crested the eastern ridge, casting long shadows across the lake. In the new light, I noticed something unusual on the far shore, a dark shape moving along the tree line. I reached for my binoculars and focused on the area. Nothing. Whatever it was had disappeared into the dense forest, probably a moose or elk coming down for a morning drink. Yet something about the movement had seemed different, more deliberate. I shook off the uneasiness. After years as a park ranger, I'd learned to trust my instincts, but I'd also learned that the forest plays tricks on the eyes, especially in the half-light of dawn. After finishing my coffee, I packed gear for the day's work. The Northwest Trail needed clearing before the seasonal influx of hikers. The Forest Service issued me standard equipment: handheld radio, first aid kit, maps, compass, multi-tool, but experience had taught me to add my own essentials: extra water, high-calorie snacks, emergency shelter, and a revolver. The gun was technically against regulations, but after an encounter with a rabid wolf 2 years ago, I never ventured into the backcountry without it. As I loaded the utility vehicle, my thoughts drifted to how I'd ended up here. Most of my academy classmates had chosen busier parks with more amenities and better pay. But something about Narration had called to me when the position opened up. Maybe it was the challenge of complete self-reliance. Maybe it was the escape from a failed relationship and mounting debts. Or maybe it was something deeper, a connection to this land that I couldn't quite explain. My grandfather would have said the mountains had chosen me, not the other way around. He believed in such things. Spirits in the trees, voices in the wind, ancient beings watching from the shadows. As a child, I'd absorbed his stories like gospel. As an adult with a degree in forestry and wildlife management, I'd filed them away as cultural mythology. Beautiful, but not literal. Yet sometimes, alone in these woods, I caught myself listening for those voices. I drove the UTV along the shoreline trail, heading northwest toward the area where fallen trees had been reported. The morning warmed quickly as spring sunshine filtered through the canopy. Birds called overhead, and occasionally I spotted deer watching curiously from the undergrowth before bounding away. About 3 miles in, I encountered the first major obstacle, a massive old-growth pine that had toppled across the trail. The trunk was over 3 feet in diameter, far too large for my chainsaw to handle in one cut. I'd need to section it carefully. As I prepared the equipment, the forest around me fell suddenly, unnaturally silent. No bird song, no rustling leaves, no chattering squirrels. Just complete stillness that prickled the hair on my neck. I switched off the chainsaw and listened. Nothing. Then, from somewhere up the slope to my right, came the distinct sound of breaking branches. Heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Ranger Rivers. Identify yourself." No response, but the sounds continued, moving parallel to the trail. Whatever was up there was large and making no effort to conceal its presence. A bear, perhaps? But bears typically avoided humans once detected. I unholstered my revolver and held it at my side, more for reassurance than any immediate intent to use it. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. The movement stopped. I could feel eyes on me, watching, assessing. I scanned the dense forest but saw nothing unusual among the trees and shadows. Then came a smell, musky, wild, unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not the familiar scent of bear or moose or any woodland creature I knew. This was different, primal. For several long minutes I stood motionless, weapon ready, senses straining. Gradually birds resumed their calls, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The presence, whatever it was, had moved on. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Logical explanations filled my mind. A moose or elk I hadn't properly identified. Perhaps even a woodland bison that had wandered from the reintroduction area 50 miles north. Yet none of these explanations felt right. With unsteady hands, I started the chainsaw again and turned my attention back to the fallen tree. But the sense of being watched never fully subsided. By late afternoon, I'd cleared 3 major blockages and numerous smaller branches from the trail. The work had been physically demanding but mentally soothing, the kind of tangible accomplishment that had drawn me to this job in the first place. As I headed back toward the station, dark clouds began gathering over the western peaks. A spring storm was rolling in, earlier than the weather report had predicted. I pushed the UTV a little faster, hoping to reach the cabin before the downpour. I was about a mile from the station when I spotted fresh tracks crossing the trail. Large, human-like footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. I stopped the vehicle and knelt to examine them more closely. The prints were unlike any human boot I'd ever seen. Elongated, nearly 18 inches in length, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Too large for a person, but too structured for a bear. I took photos with my phone and used my hand for scale. The stride length between prints was enormous, suggesting whatever made them stood well over 7 feet tall. A joke, perhaps? Some hiker with homemade Sasquatch feet playing games? But we'd had no reports of visitors in this area for weeks, and the tracks appeared fresh, made within the last few hours. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They emerged from the dense forest to my left, crossed the trail, and disappeared into the undergrowth, heading toward the lake, toward my cabin. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as I climbed back into the UTV. By the time I reached the station, the storm had arrived in full force, rain hammering the metal roof and wind howling through the pines. I quickly secured the vehicle and equipment, then made a dash for the cabin's porch. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced back toward the tree line where I'd seen movement that morning. For a split second, illuminated by a flash of lightning, I thought I saw a tall, dark figure standing among the pines, watching me. Then darkness returned, and it was gone. Inside, I peeled off my wet jacket and boots, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and poor light were playing tricks on my perception. I radioed in my return to dispatch, reported the cleared trails, and mentioned the unusual tracks I'd found. "Sounds like you've got yourself a Sasquatch, Rivers," the dispatcher laughed. "Better set out some bait if you want to catch it." "Very funny," I replied, though I couldn't muster much humor. "I'm sending photos. Have wildlife take a look, would you?" "Will do. Stay dry up there. Storm's supposed to clear by morning." After signing off, I built a fire in the small wood stove and prepared a simple dinner. The guest cabin would have to wait until tomorrow. As I ate, I found myself repeatedly glancing out the windows into the darkness, searching for, what? A creature from my grandfather's stories? I'd always prided myself on rational thinking, on scientific explanations for natural phenomena. Yet here I was, jumping at shadows and imagining monsters in the woods. I needed to get hold of myself before the researchers arrived. The last thing I wanted was to come across as some superstitious forest dweller spouting tales of woodland creatures. Still, as I prepared for bed that night, I checked that my revolver was loaded and within reach. And for the first time since taking the position at Narration Station, I locked the cabin door. Sleep came reluctantly, punctuated by vivid dreams of being pursued through endless forests by something I couldn't see, but knew was there. Always just behind me, always gaining ground. Each time I jerked awake, the storm still raged outside, and somewhere beneath the howling wind and pounding rain, I could have sworn I heard something moving around the cabin, testing the windows, searching for a way in. By morning, both the storm and my night terrors had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing a peaceful scene that made my fears seem ridiculous in retrospect. I laughed at myself as I prepared breakfast. Wildlife encounters were part of the job, and after years of experience, I should know better than to let imagination run wild. After eating, I headed out to prepare the guest cabin for the arriving researchers. The small structure stood about 50 yards from my own quarters, positioned to offer privacy while remaining close enough for convenience and safety. It was a simple design: one room with 2 beds, a small kitchenette, and basic bathroom facilities. As I approached, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The door stood ajar, though I was certain I'd secured it last fall. Inside, chaos greeted me. Bedding had been pulled from the mattresses, cabinet contents scattered across the floor, the small table overturned. My first thought was vandals, perhaps hikers who'd found the remote cabin and decided to leave their mark. But there had been no reports of anyone in the area, and the electronic trail register at the wilderness boundary hadn't recorded entries in weeks. Then I noticed the strange, musky scent I'd encountered on the trail the previous day. It permeated the cabin, stronger here in the enclosed space, and on the wooden floor, partially obscured by the scattered debris, were muddy prints, the same enormous, toe-distinguished impressions I'd photographed. Whatever had left those tracks on the trail had visited the guest cabin during the night. Not a bear rummaging for food, not vandals seeking thrills. Something else, something that moved with purpose. I backed out of the cabin, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation. But another part, perhaps the part that had listened to my grandfather's stories, whispered that some things in these ancient forests defied conventional understanding. As I stood there, torn between conflicting instincts, My radio crackled to life. Narration station, this is dispatch. I retrieved the radio from my belt with unsteady hands. Go ahead, dispatch. Just got word your university visitors will be arriving earlier than expected. They're already on the access road, should reach you within the hour. I looked back at the ransacked cabin, then at the surrounding forest that suddenly seemed full of watching eyes. Copy that, I replied, my voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. I'll be ready. But I wasn't ready, not for what had happened during the night, and certainly not for what would follow in the days ahead. As I hurried back to my cabin to retrieve cleaning supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in my peaceful wilderness domain. Something had arrived at Lake Narration, something that didn't appear in any wildlife management handbook or ranger training program, and it knew I was here. The researchers arrived just as I finished making the guest cabin presentable. I'd worked frantically to restore order, all the while trying to formulate a reasonable explanation for what had happened. Breaking and entering by wildlife seemed the most logical approach, though it didn't account for all the details. Their vehicle, a mud-splattered university-owned SUV, pulled up beside my cabin, and two figures emerged. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a wild mane of reddish hair and beard that made him look more like a Viking than an academic. The second was a slender woman with dark skin and close-cropped black hair, moving with the precise efficiency of someone who valued function over form. Ranger Rivers, the woman approached with an outstretched hand. I'm Dr. Maya Okalik. This is my colleague, Dr. Ian Donnelly. Her handshake was firm, her accent distinctly Canadian, specifically Inuit, I guessed, though I wasn't certain. Welcome to Narration Station, I replied, shaking hands with both of them. Call me Kale, everyone does. G'day, mate, Donnelly said with an unmistakable Australian inflection that seemed at odds with his Norse appearance. Beautiful spot you've got here. Reminds me of Tasmania, minus the deadly everything. I helped them unload their surprisingly extensive equipment, cameras, recording devices, sample collection kits, and several unmarked metal cases that Dr. Okalik handled with particular care. Your paperwork mentioned habitat studies, I said, curiosity getting the better of me. What exactly are you researching? The two exchanged a quick glance before Okalik answered. We're conducting bioacoustic monitoring of wilderness environments, she said, studying how sound propagates through different forest densities, and what that tells us about ecosystem health. It sounded plausible enough, though it didn't explain all their equipment, or why they'd chosen Narration, one of the most remote stations in the system, for their work. Interesting, I said, deciding not to press further for now. Let me show you to your accommodations. Fair warning, we had some wildlife get into the guest cabin last night. I've cleaned up, but there might still be some disturbance. What kind of wildlife? Donnelly asked, suddenly alert. I hesitated. Not entirely sure, larger than a bear based on the tracks. I took photos if you're interested. Again, that look between them, brief but meaningful. We'd very much like to see those, Okalik said carefully. As we approached the guest cabin, I described finding the large footprints on the trail and later discovering the break-in. I deliberately avoided mentioning my more unusual observations. The feeling of being watched, the strange scent, the shadowy figure during the storm. No need to come across as unstable on first acquaintance. Inside the cabin, the researchers inspected the space with keen interest, particularly the areas where I'd pointed out the muddy prints before cleaning them. Shame we couldn't see the originals, Donnelly muttered, kneeling to examine a faint remnant I'd missed. I took photographs, I reminded him, pulling out my phone to show them. Both researchers studied the images with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to mere scientific curiosity. Okalik's expression remained neutral, but Donnelly's eyes widened appreciably. Bloody hell, he whispered. It's just like the Patterson-Gimlin prints. The what? I asked. Okalik shot him a warning look before turning to me with a carefully composed smile. An old reference point in wildlife morphology, she explained smoothly. These are fascinating tracks, Ranger Rivers. Would you mind sending us these images? Not at all, I said, though something about their reaction nagged at me. And please, it's Kale. After helping them settle in, I returned to my own cabin to prepare dinner. I'd invited them to join me, partly out of hospitality, and partly because I was eager to learn more about my unexpected guests. As I chopped vegetables for a stew, my mind kept returning to Donnelly's comment and Okalik's quick intercession. Patterson-Gimlin wasn't a term I recognized from my wildlife management training. I opened my laptop and searched the phrase. The results were unexpected. Patterson-Gimlin referred to a famous or infamous film from 1967, purportedly showing a female Bigfoot walking along a creek bed in Northern California. The footage had been debated for decades by cryptozoologists and skeptics alike. These weren't ordinary wildlife researchers. They were Bigfoot hunters. The realization both amused and concerned me. On one hand, it explained their interest in the tracks and their elaborate equipment. On the other, it meant they'd been less than forthcoming about their true purpose here. When they arrived for dinner, I decided on a direct approach. "So," I said as I served the stew, "when were you planning to tell me you're looking for Sasquatch?" Donnelly choked on his first spoonful, while Okalik's expression flickered briefly before settling into resignation. "What gave us away?" she asked. "Patterson-Gimlin. I looked it up." I sat across from them at my small table. "Your university paperwork doesn't mention cryptozoology." Okalik sighed. "Because it wouldn't have been approved if it did. Look, we are legitimate researchers. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology, and Ian is a wildlife biometrician. We're just exploring unconventional hypotheses." "With university funding?" "The bioacoustic monitoring is real," Donnelly interjected, recovering from his surprise. "We're genuinely collecting that data. It's just not our only interest." I considered this as I ate. On a practical level, their actual research focus didn't much matter to me as long as they followed wilderness regulations and didn't disturb the environment. And if I were being honest, I was relieved their interest aligned with my recent experiences. It made me feel less like I was losing my grip on reality. "All right," I said finally. "I appreciate the honesty, and as it happens, you might find Naimishan particularly interesting at the moment." I proceeded to tell them everything. The sensation of being watched, the unnatural silence in the forest, the musky odor, and the shadowy figure during the storm. As I spoke, their initial embarrassment transformed into keen attention. "How long have you been stationed here?" Okalik asked when I finished. 3 seasons. This will be my 4th summer." "And you've never experienced anything like this before?" I shook my head. "Nothing this deliberate. We have all the usual wildlife, bears, moose, cougars, but they behave like animals. What I've been sensing feels different, intelligent." Donnelly leaned forward eagerly. "That tracks with reported encounters, awareness of human presence, curiosity mixed with caution, strategic movement patterns. These aren't simple animals. They're highly developed primates with sophisticated social structures." "If they exist at all," Okalik added with scientific caution, though her expression suggested she believed they did. "What's brought you specifically to Naimishan?" I asked. "There must be hundreds of remote areas where a Bigfoot could potentially live." The researchers exchanged another of their communicative glances before Okalik answered. "We've been tracking reports across the Pacific Northwest for years. There's been a significant uptick in potential encounters in this region over the past 6 months. 3 hikers described a large bipedal creature near Morgan Creek, about 15 miles south of here. A wildlife photographer caught what might be a partial image near Twin Pines Ridge to the east, and the most compelling, a recording of unidentified vocalizations captured by a geological survey team just north of this lake." "What kind of vocalizations?" Donnelly pulled out his phone. "Have a listen." He played an audio file that began with ordinary forest sounds: wind, birds, distant water. Then came a sound that raised the hair on my arms, a long, powerful howl that started low and rose in pitch before breaking into a series of staccato whoops. It wasn't a wolf or coyote or any animal call I recognized, and it certainly wasn't human. "That was recorded 8 miles from where we're sitting," Okalik said quietly as the recording ended. 2 months ago." We sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling around us like the gathering darkness outside. "There's something else," I said finally, "something I haven't mentioned." I told them about my grandfather and his stories, tales of ancient beings who had lived in the mountains since the beginning of time. He called them the Old Ones and described them as tall, powerful creatures covered in hair, with a deep connection to the natural world and a wariness of humans who had forgotten the old ways. In his stories, they weren't monsters, I explained. They were guardians of the wilderness, protectors of sacred places. They avoided humans when possible but would defend their territories when necessary. Many indigenous cultures have similar accounts, Okalik nodded. My own people speak of the Tornit, tall, strong beings who once lived alongside us but retreated into the wilderness when humans became too numerous. The consistency across isolated cultural traditions is one of the most compelling arguments for their existence, Donnelly added. Aboriginal Australians have the Yowie, Himalayan peoples have the Yeti, North American tribes have Sasquatch or Wendigo, all describing remarkably similar creatures. So, what's your theory? I asked. If these things are real, why haven't we found definitive proof? No bodies, no clear photographs, no DNA that can't be explained away as known species. That's what we're trying to understand, Okalik replied. The most plausible hypothesis is that they're extremely rare, highly intelligent, and deliberately evasive. Think about it, a species with human-level intelligence, but without our technological development, would evolve exceptional skills for avoiding detection, especially if they've been hunted or threatened historically. Outside, darkness had fully descended, and with it came the nighttime symphony of the forest, crickets, frogs, and the occasional distant owl. As if on cue, the sounds gradually diminished until an unnatural quiet settled around the cabin. We all noticed the change simultaneously. Donnelly moved to the window, peering out into the blackness. "Something's out there," he whispered. I reached for my flashlight, but Okalik caught my arm. "Don't," she said softly. "If it is what we think, light will drive it away." We sat in tense silence, listening intently. At first there was nothing beyond the faint whisper of wind in the pines. Then came soft, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, heavy enough to be heard but carefully placed, like someone trying to move quietly despite their size. "It's the same pattern as last night," I murmured. "Circling, testing." "It's curious," Okalik whispered, "assessing potential threat." The footsteps paused outside the window nearest to where we sat. I could feel a presence just beyond the glass, a consciousness evaluating us as thoroughly as we were trying to detect it. Then came a sound that froze my blood, a soft, rumbling vocalization somewhere between a growl and what I can only describe as speech. It wasn't random animal noise. It had structure, intentionality. Donnelly fumbled for his phone, presumably to record, but the movement seemed to startle our visitor. There was a quick series of heavy footsteps retreating from the cabin, branches breaking as something large moved rapidly through the underbrush. And then silence returned. We remained motionless for several long moments before Okalik finally spoke. 3 years of research, and that's the closest I've ever been," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "It was right there." "What do we do now?" I asked, surprised at how steady my voice remained, despite my racing heart. "We set up our equipment," Donnelly replied, already standing. "Tonight. If it returns, we need to be ready." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as the researchers unpacked their specialized gear. They explained each item as they worked: thermal imaging cameras, audio recording arrays designed to triangulate sound sources, motion sensors, and environmental sampling equipment to collect hair, saliva, or other biological materials. "We're not trying to capture or harm it," Okalik assured me, perhaps sensing my unease. "Just document, prove it exists." "And if you do?" I asked. "What happens then?" She paused in her work. "That depends on how we handle the discovery. Ideally, we establish protections, recognize status as an endangered great ape species, habitat conservation, strictly controlled research access. And less ideally?" Her expression darkened. "Media circus, trophy hunters, habitat destruction by curiosity seekers. Is that why you're being secretive? Not just because people would think you're crackpots?" "Partly," she admitted, "but mainly because we believe these creatures have survived precisely because they've remained undiscovered. Exposure before proper protections are in place could be disastrous for them. By midnight, they had established a perimeter of sensors around both cabins and into the nearby forest. We agreed to take watches throughout the night, Donnelly first, then Okalik, with me taking the pre-dawn hours. Try to get some rest, Okalik advised as I headed back to my cabin. And Kale, thank you for your understanding. Most people in your position would have radioed for a psychiatric evaluation by now. I smiled. Let's just say my grandfather's stories prepared me to keep an open mind. Back in my own space, I found sleep elusive despite my exhaustion. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind became magnified in my awareness. I'd encountered countless wild animals during my years as a ranger, faced down territorial bears and hungry wolves, navigated treacherous terrain in all weather conditions. None of it had affected me like the events of the past 2 days. Was it fear? Partly, yes. But there was something else. A sense of standing at the threshold of discovery, of having the foundations of my understanding shifted. If Okalik and Donnelly were right, if the tracks and sounds and shadowy glimpses pointed to the existence of an undocumented hominid species, it would rewrite our understanding of evolutionary history. And on a more personal level, it would mean my grandfather's stories, dismissed by so many as mere folklore, contained profound truth. My watch came at 4 a.m. I relieved Okalik, who reported nothing unusual during her shift. The monitoring equipment showed only expected wildlife movements, deer coming to the lake to drink, nocturnal rodents going about their business. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when one of the thermal sensors at the edge of their array triggered an alert. I watched the monitor as a large heat signature moved slowly along the lakeshore, well beyond normal human height. Dr. Okalik, Dr. Donnelly, I called quietly. We've got something. They emerged from the guest cabin quickly, still wearing their clothes from the previous day. Donnelly took control of the monitoring equipment, while Okalik grabbed a high-powered spotting scope. Location? She asked tersely. Northeastern shoreline, moving south, I replied, about 600 yards out. Donnelly adjusted the directional microphones, and a faint sound came through the speakers. Rhythmic splashing, like something walking through the shallow water at the lake's edge. It's using the water to mask its scent and footprints, he murmured. Clever. Through the scope, Okalik tracked the heat signature as it moved. Dawn was breaking rapidly now, the forest emerging from darkness into the gray half-light that precedes sunrise. I've got visual, she whispered excitedly. Bipedal, approximately 8 feet tall, consistent with reported morphology. She offered me the scope. With slightly trembling hands, I looked through the eyepiece and adjusted the focus. There, moving along the far shore with smooth, powerful strides, was a figure unlike anything I'd seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair or fur, it moved with a fluid grace that belied its massive size. Its arms swung longer than a human's would, occasionally touching the ground or grasping at vegetation as it passed. As I watched, it paused, then slowly turned its head toward us. Even at this distance, I could sense its awareness. It knew exactly where we were. For a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, we observed each other across the expanse of the lake. Then, with deliberate purpose, it raised an arm and appeared to gesture toward the mountains behind it, before melting into the forest with shocking speed for something so large. Did you see that? I gasped, lowering the scope. It gestured, Okalik confirmed, her voice tight with excitement. Complex communication behavior. Donnelly was already reviewing the thermal footage. We've got it recorded. Not high-resolution visible light, but definitive thermal imaging of a large bipedal subject moving in a non-human gait pattern. It was showing us something, I said, still processing what I'd witnessed. Pointing toward the mountains, or warning us away from them, Okalik suggested. We spent the morning reviewing the data they'd collected, thermal images, audio recordings, and measurements calculated from the visual reference points. Everything supported the presence of an organism matching reported Sasquatch characteristics. It's not conclusive proof, Okalik cautioned as we examined the evidence, but it's the best documentation I've seen in years of research. What now? I asked. More monitoring? Absolutely, Donnelly nodded. But we should also explore where it was directing our attention. Those ridges to the northeast, is there anything significant up there? I considered the question. There's an area locals call the Echo Valley about 4 miles in that direction. Old-growth forest, some caves formed by ancient lava tubes. It's off the marked trails, so it sees very little human traffic. Perfect Sasquatch habitat, Donnelly mused. Shelter, seclusion, likely water sources. It's rough terrain, I warned. And if there is something up there that doesn't want company. All the more reason to investigate carefully, Okalik finished. We'll need your guidance, Kale. Would you be willing to take us there tomorrow? I hesitated. My ranger duties technically covered trail maintenance and visitor safety, not escorting Bigfoot researchers on speculative expeditions. Yet my curiosity was thoroughly piqued, and as the local authority, I justified that investigating unusual activity in the wilderness was within my purview. I'll take you, I agreed. But we go prepared, move carefully, and at the first sign of danger, we retreat, no arguments. They readily agreed to my terms, and we spent the remainder of the day preparing for the expedition. I plotted our route, ensuring we had alternate paths for both ascent and descent if needed. The researchers gathered their portable recording equipment and sample collection materials. That evening, as we finalized our preparations, I found myself remembering more of my grandfather's stories, particularly his warnings about respecting the domains of the old ones. They watch from the high places, he would say, his weathered face solemn in the firelight. Those who enter their sacred grounds uninvited may never return to tell what they found. As a child, such tales had thrilled and frightened me. As an adult, I'd dismissed them as cautionary fables, designed to keep curious children from wandering too far. Now, I wasn't so sure. After the researchers returned to their cabin, I sat alone on my porch, watching darkness claim the forest once more. The lake reflected a sky brilliant with stars, the Milky Way stretching across the heavens like a river of light. In such moments, the modern world with its certainties and scientific classifications seemed very far away. What if we were wrong about so many things? What if the natural world contained mysteries that had evaded our instruments and methodologies precisely because they existed at the edges of our understanding? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, a long, mournful call echoed across the lake. The same haunting vocalization we'd heard on Donnelly's recording, but closer now, more powerful. It reverberated through the trees and seemed to penetrate directly into my chest, ancient and wild and utterly beyond human experience. From the guest cabin, I heard excited movement, as the researchers presumably scrambled to document the sound. But I remained motionless, letting the call wash over me, speaking to something primal in my own consciousness. It wasn't a warning or a threat. It was a proclamation, a reminder that these mountains and forests existed long before humans named and claimed them, and would endure long after our brief stewardship ended. Whatever awaited us in Echo Valley, I knew with sudden clarity that we weren't the discoverers here. We were the discovered, assessed, and permitted to proceed, or not, according to judgments we could barely comprehend. The call faded gradually, leaving behind a profound silence filled with possibility and danger in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring us face to face with something that had persisted at the margins of human awareness for centuries. I just hoped we were ready for what we would find. Dawn broke with unsettling serenity, as if the forest were deliberately withholding its secrets in the growing light. We set out early, the three of us moving in silent procession along the lake's edge before turning northeast toward the distant ridgeline. I led the way, rifle slung across my back, a precaution I'd insisted upon, despite Okalik's concerns about appearing threatening. It's not just for the Sasquatch, I'd explained. There are more conventional predators out there too. The terrain grew steadily more challenging as we left the established trails behind. Ancient trees created a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Moss-covered logs and tumbled boulders testified to centuries of growth, decay, and geological upheaval. In places, we had to navigate ravines choked with devil's club and stinging nettle, their thorns and irritants an effective deterrent to casual exploration. Donnelly proved surprisingly adept in the wilderness for an academic, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time in rough country. Okalik was methodical and determined, pausing occasionally to collect samples or take readings from her various instruments. The ecosystem here is remarkably undisturbed, she noted, as we rested beside a clear mountain stream. Some of these trees must be over 500 years old. The terrain has protected it, I explained. Too difficult for logging operations, too remote for tourism development. One of the few truly wild places left. Perfect refuge, Donnelly murmured, scanning the dense undergrowth that surrounded us. If you needed to avoid human detection, you couldn't design a better habitat. We continued upward, the slope growing steeper as we approached Echo Valley. The forest thinned somewhat at higher elevation, replaced by jumbles of volcanic rock interspersed with hardy pines that thrived in the thin soil. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the mineral scent of distant snow still clinging to the highest peaks. It was nearly noon when we crested a final rise and Echo Valley spread before us, a natural amphitheater of steep walls embracing a bowl of vibrant green meadow bisected by a meandering stream. At the valley's far end, dark openings in the rock face marked the entrance to the lava tube system I'd mentioned. It's beautiful, Okalik breathed, completely sheltered from view until you're right upon it. We descended carefully into the valley, all senses alert for any sign of unusual activity. The meadowgrass showed game trails, deer and elk primarily, but I noted areas where the vegetation was crushed in patterns inconsistent with four-legged animals. These disturbances formed rough paths leading toward the cave entrances. As we neared the stream, Donnelly suddenly raised his hand in a silent signal to stop. He pointed to a muddy section of the bank where a series of clear footprints were impressed in the soft earth, the same distinctive tracks we'd seen near the cabin, but fresher. "Recent," he whispered, kneeling to examine them more closely. Within the last few hours, Okalik removed a casting kit from her pack and quickly created plaster molds of several prints, while Donnelly photographed the area extensively. I stood guard, rifle at the ready, eyes constantly sweeping our surroundings. Despite the bright sunshine and open meadow, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. The stride length is consistent with a creature approximately 8 feet tall, Okalik reported as she packed away her samples. And look here, toe flexibility and pressure distribution indicating significant dexterity and adaptability to rough terrain. There are multiple sets, Donnelly added, gesturing to overlapping tracks, at least 3 distinct individuals based on size variation. The implications settled uneasily in my mind. Not a lone creature, but multiple beings moving purposefully through this hidden valley. A family group? A community? The caves are the logical next step, Okalik suggested, gazing toward the dark openings in the distance. I hesitated. If these are intelligent beings with a social structure, those caves might be their home. Entering would be an intrusion. "We'll be respectful," she assured me. "Observe only from the entrance if possible. No deep exploration without clear signs it's safe to proceed." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we continued across the meadow toward the cave system. As we approached, the entrances resolved into 3 distinct openings of varying sizes. The largest was easily 15 feet high, a yawning portal into darkness that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The area around the entrances showed clear signs of regular use: packed earth, broken branches arranged in patterns too deliberate to be natural, and most tellingly, a collection of large bones stacked neatly to one side of the main opening. Examination showed them to be predominantly deer and elk, with some smaller mammals mixed in. "Food remains," Donnelly whispered, "but organized, not scattered like you'd see at a predator's den." Okalik knelt beside a flat stone positioned near the entrance. Its surface bore dark stains and deep scoring marks. "Cutting tool marks," she murmured. "They're processing their food." The evidence of tool use and organizational behavior sent a shiver down my spine. These weren't simple animals operating on instinct. Whatever lived here demonstrated complex, learned behaviors passed down through observation and instruction. We approached the main cave entrance cautiously. The temperature dropped noticeably as we neared the opening, cool air flowing outward in a gentle but persistent current. Strange, musty odors wafted from within. The familiar musky scent I'd encountered before, but also wood smoke, decaying vegetation, and something else I couldn't identify. Donnelly set up a powerful lantern that cast light several yards into the cave, revealing a wide, smooth-floored passage that curved gradually leftward before disappearing into darkness. The walls showed signs of both natural formation and deliberate modification, areas smoothed by tools, niches carved into the rock that held various objects, stones of unusual shapes and colors, feathers, animal bones, and what appeared to be crude implements fashioned from wood and stone. "This is beyond anything we've documented," Okalik said, her voice barely audible. "Evidence of material culture, tool use, possibly ritual objects." She was reaching for her camera when a sound froze us in place, a low, rhythmic thumping emanating from deep within the cave system. It wasn't mechanical but rather organic, like large hands beating against hollow logs or stone. The rhythm was complex, changing in ways that suggested communication rather than random noise. "It's a warning," I said instinctively, though I couldn't have explained how I knew. As if confirming my interpretation, a powerful vocalization followed the drumming, the now familiar howl breaking into whoops, but this time with distinct variations and patterns. It echoed through the cave and across the valley, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock walls. "They're speaking," Donnelly whispered in awe. "Complex vocalization consistent with rudimentary language." "We should leave," I urged, the hair on my neck rising. "We've seen enough. They know we're here, and they're telling us to go." Okalik hesitated, clearly torn between scientific opportunity and personal safety. "Just a few photographs of the cultural artifacts. Quick documentation, then we'll retreat." Before I could object further, the rhythmic thumping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound could have been. Then came heavy footsteps from within the cave, moving toward us with deliberate purpose. "Out, now!" I commanded, backing away from the entrance, while keeping my rifle lowered but ready. The researchers finally heeded my warning, gathering their equipment with hasty movements. We retreated about 50 yards from the cave entrance, putting a large boulder between us and whatever was emerging. Peering cautiously around our shelter, we watched as a massive figure appeared at the cave mouth, taller than any human, heavily muscled, and covered in dark reddish-brown hair. It stood upright on two legs, but occasionally rested its long arms on the ground, knuckles touching the earth in a manner reminiscent of gorillas. Its face was the most striking feature, a broad, flattened nose, heavy brow ridge, and deep-set eyes that gleamed with unmistakable intelligence. The creature surveyed the area methodically, head turning to scan each section of the meadow before focusing directly on our position. It knew exactly where we were. A second figure appeared beside the first, slightly smaller but with similar features, perhaps female to the first one's male. They communicated with short, guttural vocalizations and hand gestures, clearly discussing our presence and how to respond. "They're deciding whether we're a threat," Okalik whispered, her scientific detachment warring with very human fear. The creatures continued their consultation for several minutes while we remained frozen in place. Then, with startling decisiveness, the larger one strode forward into the meadow, covering ground with long, powerful steps. It stopped about halfway between the cave and our position, straightened to its full height, easily 8 feet tall, and pounded its chest with alternating fists. The sound echoed across the valley, a demonstration of strength that needed no translation. Then it extended one massive arm, pointing first at us, then emphatically back the way we had come. The message couldn't have been clearer: leave, now. "We need to go," I said quietly. "No sudden movements. Back away slowly, maintaining eye contact but not directly staring." We began our careful retreat, moving backward up the slope we had descended earlier. The creature remained motionless, watching our withdrawal with unsettling focus. When we reached the ridgeline that marked the valley's edge, it finally turned and loped back to the cave entrance with surprising speed and grace for something so large. We continued our retreat for another half-mile before stopping to process what we'd witnessed. "That was extraordinary," Donnelly breathed, his hand shaking as he checked the camera he'd somehow managed to use during our encounter. "Direct interaction with an undocumented hominid species. Did you get any recordings?" O'Callaghan nodded, her scientific composure returning. "Audio and some basic thermal imaging. Not high resolution from this distance, but corroborating evidence at minimum." "They let us go," I said, still trying to reconcile what I'd seen with my understanding of the natural world. "They could have attacked. We were outnumbered and they clearly had the physical advantage, but they chose to warn us off instead." "Conflict avoidance," O'Callaghan suggested, "consistent with a species that survived alongside humans by minimizing direct confrontation." "But the warning was clear," I insisted. "They've established a boundary. I don't think we should test it again." The researchers exchanged looks, clearly reluctant to abandon such a rich research opportunity. But the encounter had shaken them enough that they didn't immediately argue. "Let's get back to the station," Donnelly suggested. "Review what we've collected. Develop a more comprehensive approach." The return journey felt much longer than our morning hike. Every shadow among the trees, every snapping twig or rustling leaf, heightened our awareness of being in territory that wasn't truly ours. The wilderness I'd thought I knew intimately had revealed itself to be home to beings I'd believed existed only in folklore. We were perhaps 2 miles from the station when O'Callaghan, who had been consulting one of her instruments, suddenly stopped. "Something's following us," she said quietly, 300 yards back, moving parallel to our trail. Donnelly checked the thermal imaging device. Confirmed, large heat signature, bipedal movement pattern. "One of them is tracking us," I murmured, making sure we're leaving as instructed. We continued at a steady pace, neither rushing nor dawdling, as if to demonstrate our compliance with the unspoken agreement. Our shadow maintained its distance, occasionally visible as a dark shape moving through the trees when the foliage thinned. The sun was setting by the time we reached the lake, casting long shadows across the water. As we emerged from the forest onto the shoreline path, I glanced back one last time. There, at the edge of the tree line, stood our follower, a silhouette against the gathering darkness. It raised one arm in what seemed almost like a farewell gesture, then melted back into the forest. At the cabins, we collapsed into chairs on my porch, exhausted physically and emotionally by the day's events. For several minutes, no one spoke, each of us privately processing what we had witnessed. "What now?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. O'Callaghan looked thoughtful. "We have preliminary evidence of an undocumented hominid species with complex social structures, tool use, possible language, and territorial behaviors. Under normal circumstances, this would justify a major scientific expedition." "But these aren't normal circumstances," Donnelly finished. "These beings have clearly demonstrated their desire for privacy. Invading their territory with a large research team could provoke conflict. Not to mention the broader implications," I added. "Once word gets out, this place would be overrun with curiosity seekers, media, potential trophy hunters. Their way of life would be destroyed." The ethical dilemma hung in the air between us. As scientists, they had discovered something that could rewrite our understanding of hominid evolution and validate decades of dismissed research. As human beings, they recognized the moral complexity of forcing contact on beings that clearly wish to remain hidden. "Perhaps there's a middle path," O'Callaghan suggested after lengthy consideration. "We document what we've seen, secure independent verification from trusted colleagues, and simultaneously work to establish legal protections for this area before making any public announcements." "That could take years," Donnelly pointed out. "Yes," she agreed. "But these beings have remained undiscovered for centuries. A few more years to ensure their safety seems reasonable." I found myself appreciating their thoughtfulness. They weren't trophy hunters seeking fame at any cost, but genuine researchers wrestling with the profound responsibility their discovery entailed. "Whatever you decide," I said, "I need to report this to my supervisors. Unusual activity in my jurisdiction, potential visitor safety concerns. I can't keep this completely quiet." "We understand," O'Callaghan nodded. But perhaps we can collaborate on how the information is presented. Frame it as unverified sightings of unusual wildlife, requests for increased patrol presence rather than public alerts that would draw attention. It seemed a reasonable compromise. We agreed to spend one more day at the station, compiling our observations and evidence into organized reports, before heading back to civilization to begin the delicate process of verification and protection. Later that night, after the researchers retired to their cabin, I sat alone beside the lake, watching moonlight ripple across the water. The day's encounters had fundamentally shifted my perspective on the wilderness I thought I knew. These ancient forests were not merely resources to be managed or playgrounds for human recreation, but homes to beings with their own societies, their own ways of understanding the world. My grandfather's stories, dismissed as fantasy by my educated adult self, now seemed like vital cultural knowledge passed down through generations, warnings and wisdom about coexisting with the other inhabitants of these mountains. From across the water came a now familiar call, the haunting vocalization that seemed to bridge the gap between animal sound and human speech. It echoed between the mountain peaks, answered by another call from a different direction, then another. They were communicating, discussing perhaps the strange humans who had entered their territory and been allowed to leave, deciding maybe whether we could be trusted with the knowledge of their existence. I hoped we could prove worthy of that trust. Morning brought heavy fog that clung to the lake and wound through the trees like ghostly fingers. The world beyond my porch disappeared into swirling white, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. Even the reliable sounds of forest birds were muted, as if the wilderness itself were holding its breath. I was finishing my coffee when a sharp knock at my door announced Donnelly's arrival. His usual exuberance had been replaced by tense anxiety. "Maya's missing," he said without preamble. "What do you mean, missing?" "She went out before dawn to check the perimeter sensors. Said she'd be back in 20 minutes. That was 2 hours ago." Cold dread settled in my stomach. "Did she say which direction she was heading?" "Northeast, toward where we picked up activity yesterday. I've tried radioing, but there's no response." I grabbed my gear without hesitation. Radio, first aid kit, GPS unit, rifle. "Show me which way she went." Outside, the fog rendered visibility to mere yards. Donnelly led me to the edge of the clearing where a faint trail of footprints was barely visible in the damp earth, heading into the forest toward Echo Valley. "Why would she go back there alone?" I muttered, more to myself than Donnelly. "After yesterday's warning?" "She was excited about the documentation we gathered," he replied, his Australian accent thickening with worry. "Said something about getting clearer audio recordings of morning vocalizations when they might be most active." I keyed my radio. "Dr. Okalik, this is Ranger Rivers. Please respond." Static was the only reply. I tried twice more with the same result. "The mountains sometimes block transmission," I explained, though we both knew that didn't fully account for the silence. "Let's follow her trail as far as we can in this fog. If we haven't found her by the time visibility improves, I'll call for backup." The tracking was difficult in the misty conditions. Okalik had clearly tried to be careful, but occasional broken twigs and disturbed undergrowth confirmed her passage. She had indeed been heading back toward Echo Valley, though whether she intended to reach the caves or merely set up recording equipment at a safe distance wasn't clear. We'd been following her trail for nearly an hour when Donnelly spotted something caught on a thorny bush, a small scrap of fabric that matched Okalik's jacket. Beyond it, the signs of her passage became more erratic, with wider spaces between identifiable tracks and increasing disturbance to the surrounding vegetation. "She was moving faster here," I observed, examining broken branches that hung askew. "Running, possibly." Donnelly's face paled. "From what?" The question lingered unanswered as we pressed forward, now moving with greater caution. The fog was beginning to lift, allowing glimpses of the terrain ahead. We were on the lower slopes leading up to Echo Valley, but still a good mile from the ridge that overlooked the meadow. I was about to suggest calling in additional rangers when a sound stopped us cold, a high, thin cry that echoed briefly before being cut short, human unmistakably and filled with fear. "Maya!" Donnelly shouted, surging forward before I could stop him. "Wait," I called, but he was already crashing through the underbrush in the direction of the cry. Cursing under my breath, I raced after him, trying to balance speed with necessary caution. We burst into a small clearing to find Okalik's equipment scattered across the ground, her backpack torn open, contents strewn about, recording devices smashed. Of Okalik herself, there was no sign, but a clear trail of massive footprints and disturbed earth led away from the scene, heading deeper into the forest. "They've taken her," Donnelly whispered, face ashen, as he knelt beside her destroyed equipment. I assessed the scene carefully. It doesn't make sense. They let us leave peacefully yesterday. Why take aggressive action now? Maybe she got too close. Maybe they saw her equipment as threatening. He picked up a shattered audio recorder. "We have to find her." "We need backup," I insisted, reaching for my radio. "This is beyond what the two of us can handle safely. By the time help arrives, it could be too late." Donnelly's voice cracked with emotion. "These creatures are intelligent but unpredictable if they perceive her as a threat." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. We both understood the potential danger Okalik faced if her captors decided she represented a risk to their security. I made a quick decision. "I'll call for support to be ready at the station, but we'll continue tracking while we wait. Stay close to me, follow my lead, and if I say we pull back, we pull back. No arguments." Donnelly nodded grimly, and I made the call to dispatch, keeping my explanation deliberately vague. A researcher had gone missing, possible wildlife involvement, requesting standby support. I didn't mention Sasquatch or kidnapping. That would either delay help with psychiatric evaluations or bring a circus of attention we couldn't afford. The trail left by Okalik's captors was clear, despite their apparent attempt to minimize signs of passage. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and occasional clear footprints marked their route. But strangely, they weren't heading toward Echo Valley. Instead, they were moving westward, parallel to the lake, but deeper in the forest than the usual trails. "They're not taking her to the caves," I noted as we followed cautiously. "They're heading somewhere else." "Is there anything in that direction? Another shelter, another valley?" I consulted my mental map of the area. There's a series of ridges, some old-growth forest that survived the wildfires 30 years ago. No marked trails or known features of interest. "Unknown to humans, maybe," Donnelly muttered. We continued for another mile, the forest growing denser and more primeval as we moved into an area I had rarely patrolled. Ancient trees towered overhead, their massive trunks covered in thick moss, roots creating natural archways and hollows. The ground grew increasingly rugged, with sharp upthrusts of volcanic rock breaking through the soil like the bones of the earth itself. The trail suddenly disappeared at the base of a near-vertical rock face some 40 feet high. No footprints continued in either direction along its base. "Did they climb?" Donnelly asked, examining the rough surface. "With a struggling human captive?" "Unlikely." I scanned the rock face carefully, looking for any sign of passage. My eye caught a subtle shadow that didn't match the surrounding patterns, a dark recess, partially hidden by hanging vines and roots. "There," I pointed. "I think it's an opening." We approached cautiously. Pulling aside the curtain of vegetation revealed a narrow fissure in the rock, just wide enough for a human to squeeze through sideways. Cool air flowed outward, carrying that now familiar musky scent, along with the mineral smell of wet stone. "Another cave system," Donnelly whispered. "Not on any of your maps?" I shook my head. "Completely unknown, at least officially." From beyond the opening came a sound that froze my blood. Okalik's voice, distant but clear, calling Donnelly's name. She was alive. Donnelly immediately moved toward the entrance, but I caught his arm. "Wait," I cautioned. "This could be more complex than it appears. If they wanted to harm her, they could have done so where they found her. The fact that they brought her here suggests something else is happening." "Like what? A hostage situation?" His voice was taut with strain. "I don't know, but rushing in blindly won't help her." I pulled a powerful flashlight from my pack. "We go slowly, quietly, and together. Understand?" He nodded reluctantly, and we slipped through the narrow entrance into darkness. The passage widened immediately beyond the fissure, opening into a tunnel large enough for us to walk upright. The floor sloped gently downward, worn smooth by what must have been centuries of use. My flashlight revealed walls marked with ochre and black pigments in patterns too deliberate to be natural, handprints, animal figures, and abstract symbols that stirred something in my memory. "These are pictographs," I whispered. "Ancient rock art." "How ancient?" Donnelly asked, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his concern for Okalik. "Some similar ones in this region have been dated to over 3,000 years old." I moved the light slowly across the images. "But these look maintained, renewed." We continued deeper into the cave system, the passage occasionally branching or opening into larger chambers before narrowing again. Throughout, the walls bore similar markings, growing more elaborate as we progressed. Some depicted recognizable animals, deer, eagle, bear, while others showed tall, broad-shouldered figures that could only be representations of the beings we had encountered. The air grew warmer, more humid, and the sound of flowing water reached us from somewhere ahead. We rounded a final bend and emerged into a vast cavern illuminated by an eerie, phosphorescent blue-green light emanating from patches of fungus or lichen growing on the walls and ceiling. At the center of the chamber was a pool of clear water fed by a small waterfall bursting from the rock face. The pool drained away into another passage, creating a stream that disappeared into the darkness. Around this natural feature, the cave floor had been modified into distinct living areas, raised platforms covered with woven mats of plant material, niches carved into the walls holding various artifacts, and what appeared to be designated spaces for food preparation and tool-making. And there, seated on a stone dais near the pool, was Dr. Maya Okalik, alive, apparently unharmed, and deep in conversation with three of the creatures we had come to think of as Sasquatch. She wasn't bound or restrained in any way. Instead, she sat cross-legged, notebook open on her lap, hands moving in expressive gestures as she communicated with the beings around her. One, the large male we had seen the previous day, responded with similar hand movements, interspersed with soft vocalizations. "She's talking with them," Donnelly breathed in astonishment. At the sound of his voice, all heads turned in our direction. The largest creature rose to its full height, an imposing figure in the strange blue light, but made no aggressive move. Okalik quickly stood and called out to us, "Ian, Kale, it's okay. They're not hostile. They brought me here to communicate." We approached cautiously, still uncertain of our welcome. As we drew closer, I noticed more details of the beings we were encountering. Their hair-covered bodies revealed subtle variations in coloration and facial features. The presumed male had streaks of silver in his otherwise dark pelage, while the smaller female's coat had a reddish tint. The third, smaller than the others, appeared juvenile. "This is extraordinary," Donnelly murmured, eyes wide with wonder. "A completely undocumented social group with complex cultural behaviors?" Okalik gestured for us to join her, her expression a mixture of excitement and awe. "They've been trying to communicate with us since we arrived," she explained rapidly. "The destroyed equipment wasn't an attack. They were examining it and didn't understand its fragility. When they realized I was alone, they decided to bring me here, to show me." "Show you what?" I asked, still keeping a cautious distance from our hosts. "Their home, their history." She gestured to the pictographs that covered the walls of the main chamber. "They've been here for thousands of years, living alongside humans but separate, watching our development, our expansion." "How are you communicating?" Donnelly asked, his scientific curiosity fully engaged despite the bizarre circumstances. "Combination of sign language, drawings, and some vocalizations I'm starting to recognize. They're incredibly intelligent, Ian. They have a complex language of their own, and some of them have learned to understand human speech, though their vocal anatomy prevents them from reproducing it precisely." The largest of the creatures, the silverback, as I found myself thinking of him, moved forward with deliberate slowness, stopping a few feet from where we stood. His deep-set eyes studied us with undeniable intelligence, assessing our reactions and demeanor. Then, with movements that seemed practiced but not entirely natural, he raised his hands and formed distinct signs that even I could recognize as American Sign Language, Friend, welcome, peace. Donnelly gasped. They've adapted human sign language? Selectively, Okalik nodded. They've observed human behavior for generations, learning what they could from a distance. They know multiple human languages but primarily use their own communication systems. The silverback signed again. Why here? Why now? Okalik turned to us. They want to know why we've come to their territory now, after so long avoiding direct contact. I thought about my grandfather's stories, about the traditions that spoke of these beings as guardians of wild places. Ask them if humans once knew them better in the past. She relayed the question through signs and gestures. The silverback nodded, a surprisingly human motion, and responded with an elaborate series of signs that Okalik struggled to translate completely. Long ago, humans and, I think forest people is the closest translation, lived with understanding. Humans brought gifts, showed respect. Forest people protected sacred places, kept dangerous spirits away. She paused as he continued signing. Then new humans came, with loud weapons and no respect. Forest people retreated deeper into the mountains, avoided all humans. European colonization, Donnelly whispered, the displacement of indigenous cultures disrupted the previous equilibrium. The silverback continued his communication, becoming more animated. Okalik translated haltingly. Now humans everywhere. Cut trees, bring loud machines. No safety for forest people. Some family groups gone. Only few remain. He gestured to the small group around him. We watch, we listen, we decide. Decide what? I asked. The answer came with solemn gravity. If humans can be trusted again. The implication was clear. They had revealed themselves to us deliberately, a test to see how we would respond to their existence, whether we would respect their privacy and territory or exploit our discovery for personal gain. Ask them why they chose us, Donnelly suggested. Why now? Why here? After relaying the question, Okalik translated the response. You, the silverback pointed at me, have old blood, old knowledge. Grandfather taught you. We watched many seasons. You protect forest, not destroy. I felt a chill run through me. They had been observing me for years, evaluating my behavior, my stewardship of the wilderness, and somehow they knew about my grandfather, about the stories he had passed down to me. And us? Donnelly asked, indicating himself and Okalik. You search for truth, not for killing, not for fame. We heard your words at Fire Circle. The silverback mimicked sitting around a campfire. You spoke of protection, of keeping forest people safe from bad humans. They had been close enough to our cabins to overhear our conversations, close enough to understand our intentions and judge them worthy of this unprecedented contact. For the next several hours, we engaged in the most extraordinary exchange of information. Through Okalik's increasingly fluid translation, we learned fragments of their history, their perception of human development, and their current challenges. In return, we explained our research, our desire to document their existence while ensuring their protection. The juvenile seemed particularly fascinated by our equipment, especially my camera. With the silverback's permission, I demonstrated how it worked, showing them the digital images I captured. The concept of creating permanent images clearly wasn't new to them. The pictographs throughout the cave system proved that. But the immediacy of digital photography elicited sounds of what I interpreted as appreciation or wonder. As our unprecedented meeting continued, I found myself reassessing everything I thought I knew about the natural world and humanity's place within it. These beings weren't simply undiscovered primates, but intelligent, culture-bearing people with their own history, language, and understanding of the world. A parallel development of consciousness that had remained hidden alongside our own. Eventually, the quality of light from the cave entrance began to change, indicating the approaching sunset. The silverback noticed this and communicated something to Okalik that made her expression grow serious. They say we must leave before dark, she translated. Other forest people are coming, from different family groups. Some don't agree with talking to humans, could be dangerous. Different groups have different attitudes toward humans? Donnelly asked. Yes, this group, They call themselves something like river watchers, are more open to limited contact. Others have suffered more from human expansion, hunting, habitat destruction. They're hostile to any human presence. The urgency of departure became clear as distant vocalizations echoed through the cave system, calls similar to those we'd heard before but with harsher, more aggressive tones. "We need to go," I said, gathering our equipment. "Now." The silverback nodded in agreement and gestured for us to follow him. Rather than returning the way we had come, he led us through a different passage that gradually sloped upward. After several minutes of climbing, we emerged from a well-concealed exit onto a forested slope with a view of the lake in the distance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. Our guide pointed toward the distant lights of the ranger station, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the surrounding wilderness before pointing to his chest and those of his family members. The message needed no translation. "This is our home. Respect it." With a final acknowledging nod to each of us, the silverback and his family melted into the gathering darkness with astonishing silence for beings of such size. We made our way back to the station in contemplative silence, each processing the profound implications of our encounter. It was fully dark by the time we reached the cabins, guided by the beam of my flashlight and the occasional glimpse of stars through the forest canopy. As we approached the clearing, I noticed unusual lights, the unmistakable red and blue flashing of emergency vehicles. "Looks like dispatch sent that backup after all," I murmured. "This is going to be complicated." 2 Forest Service trucks and a Sheriff's Department SUV were parked in front of my cabin. As we emerged from the trees, several figures moved toward us, flashlights sweeping in our direction. "Ranger Rivers," called a familiar voice. "Jack Peterson, my direct supervisor from regional headquarters. Where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours." "Sorry, sir," I replied, thinking quickly. "We were in a search area with poor radio reception. Dr. O'Callagh wandered off trail this morning, and we've been tracking her. Found her about 2 miles northeast, slightly disoriented, but unharmed." O'Callagh picked up my cue smoothly. "Yes, entirely my fault. I was recording bird vocalizations and lost track of time and direction. So embarrassing to have caused such concern." Peterson seemed skeptical, but didn't press immediately. "Well, you've got everyone worried sick. Sheriff's Department was about to organize a full search party." "Completely unnecessary now," Donnelly chimed in with forced cheerfulness. "All's well that ends well, eh?" As the emergency responders packed up, reassured that the situation was resolved, Peterson pulled me aside. "Rivers, what's really going on up here? Dispatch said something about destroyed equipment and possible wildlife involvement. Then we arrive and find sophisticated monitoring gear set up around your cabins." He gestured toward the sensors the researchers had installed. "This doesn't look like standard ornithological research to me." I chose my words carefully. "The researchers are conducting some specialized environmental monitoring. As for the damaged equipment, Dr. O'Callagh believes it was likely a curious bear. Nothing that warrants ongoing concern." He studied me for a long moment. "You know, there have been strange reports from this area for years. Hikers hearing unusual sounds, glimpsing large figures in the forest. Most of us write it off as imagination or misidentified wildlife. But you've always struck me as a no-nonsense type, Rivers." "I appreciate that, sir. So I'll ask you directly. Is there something in these woods that headquarters should know about? Something that might represent a threat to visitors or staff?" I met his gaze steadily. "No threat, sir, as long as visitors respect wilderness regulations and stay on marked trails. The backcountry here is remote and challenging. People need to be properly prepared and follow established guidelines." It wasn't a direct answer to his question, but it wasn't a lie either. The beings we had encountered posed no danger to humans who respected their territory. Peterson seemed to accept this, though his expression suggested he knew I was withholding something. "All right, Rivers, I trust your judgment, but I want daily check-ins from now on, and immediate notification of any unusual incidents." "Yes, sir. Understood." After the official vehicles departed, the 3 of us gathered in my cabin, the weight of our shared secret creating a new bond between us. "What do we do now?" Donnelly asked, breaking the silence. We have evidence of a previously undocumented hominid species with complex language, social structures, and cultural behaviors. This could be the most significant anthropological discovery of the century. Or a catastrophe for them if handled badly, Okalik countered. If their existence becomes public knowledge before proper protections are in place, their way of life could be destroyed overnight. I considered the trust that had been placed in us, not just by the beings we now knew existed, but by my grandfather and all those who had preserved the knowledge of these forest people through generations of stories dismissed as mere folklore. I think we need to honor the choice they've made, I said finally. They revealed themselves to us deliberately, testing whether humans could be trusted again after generations of conflict and avoidance. How we respond to that trust will determine not just the fate of this particular group, but potentially all the remaining family groups in the region. So we proceed carefully, Okalik nodded. Documented evidence kept secure. Controlled disclosure to select scientific colleagues who share our commitment to protection. Advocacy for expanded wilderness preservation in this region, without revealing the specific reason. And we continue the dialogue they've initiated, Donnelly added. Learn their language more thoroughly, understand their needs and boundaries, establish a foundation for limited but respectful coexistence. It was an enormous responsibility, becoming the intermediaries between two intelligent species with a complex and often troubled history of interaction. Yet as I looked out the window toward the dark forest beyond, I felt a sense of profound privilege alongside the weight of that responsibility. For thousands of years, these beings had watched humanity's rise from the shadows of the wilderness, adapting and surviving as our civilization expanded into their territories. Now they had chosen to reveal themselves again, to reach across the divide of separate development and attempt communication. In that moment, I understood why my grandfather had insisted I learn the old stories, why he had given me a name that meant guardian of the people. Perhaps some part of him had known that I would one day stand at this crossroads, trusted by both worlds to help forge a path forward. Outside, from the distant ridgeline, came the now familiar call, that haunting, powerful vocalization that seemed to bridge the gap between animal sound and human speech. It echoed across the lake and through the ancient trees, a reminder of mysteries still unfolding in the deepest corners of the wilderness. And for the first time, I understood it not as a warning or a territorial claim, but as an invitation to a new kind of understanding between two worlds that had always existed side by side, separated only by our inability to truly see what had been there all along. The weeks following our extraordinary encounter passed in a blur of clandestine activity. Okalik and Donnelly extended their stay at Nemetian Station, officially continuing their bioacoustic monitoring, while actually establishing the foundations for ongoing communication with the river watchers. We proceeded with extreme caution, respecting the boundaries the forest people had established. They controlled the timing and location of our meetings, always in different places, always with clear escape routes for both parties. Sometimes only the silverback would appear. Other times he brought family members, including the juvenile, who showed particular interest in our world. Okalik made remarkable progress with their language, a complex system combining vocalizations, hand gestures, and body postures. She determined that they called themselves something that translated roughly as the first people, considering themselves the original inhabitants of the mountain forests before humans arrived. Through these careful exchanges, we learned fragments of their history and culture. They possessed an oral tradition extending back thousands of years, passed down through generations with meticulous attention to detail. They spoke of a time when their kind was more numerous, when they had interacted more openly with certain human tribes who approached them with respect and offerings. The arrival of European settlers had changed everything. The newcomers brought weapons that killed from a distance, an insatiable hunger for resources, and no understanding of the forest's delicate balance. The first people had retreated deeper into the wilderness, a strategic withdrawal that had saved them from extinction but resulted in their gradual fade into legend among human societies. They've been watching us the entire time, Donnelly marveled after one particularly illuminating session. Observing our technological development, our wars, our environmental impacts. They know more about us than we know about them. Which explains their caution, Okalik added. They've seen what happens when humans discover something valuable or unique. I found myself increasingly drawn to these encounters, not just for their scientific significance, but for the personal connection I felt to the forest people. Something about their presence resonated with the stories my grandfather had told, with the name he had given me. In their company, I felt a sense of belonging I'd never fully experienced in human society. The silverback, whom we had come to call Sentinel based on Okalik's translation of his role in the group, seemed to recognize this connection. During our meetings, he often directed specific communications to me, referring to knowledge passed down through generations, to ancient agreements between our kinds that had been forgotten by most humans but preserved in the memories of the first people. It was during one such exchange, about a month after our initial contact, that Sentinel revealed the true reason they had chosen to reveal themselves now, after centuries of successful concealment. We had met in a small valley north of the lake, a natural amphitheater of stone surrounded by ancient cedars. Okalik, translated as Sentinel, communicated through an increasingly sophisticated blend of sign language and vocalizations that she had begun to understand. The world is changing, the climate shifts, the patterns of rain and snow are not as they were. The animals move to new territories or disappear entirely. The trees sicken from heat and new diseases. This matched our scientific understanding of climate change impacts on wilderness areas, but hearing it from a being whose people had observed these forests for thousands of years gave it new weight. The safe places grow fewer, Sentinel continued through Okalik's translation. The family groups are separated by human roads, human towns. Once we could travel from the great northern ice to the warm southern valleys. Now, isolated pockets. No exchange between groups. Weakness comes from this. Genetic isolation, Donnelly murmured. They're facing population fragmentation and inbreeding depression. Sentinel nodded, understanding the concept, if not the specific terms. He continued his explanation. We watch humans, some destroy, some protect. We see how humans can change their own behavior when they understand. We decide, careful revelation to trusted humans might help first people survive the great changes coming. They're initiating contact as a survival strategy, Okalik translated with growing excitement. They recognize that without some level of human awareness and protection, their remaining habitats could be destroyed through climate change and continued development. But why us specifically? Donnelly asked. Why not approach conservation organizations or government wildlife agencies directly? Sentinel pointed at me. Old blood, old knowledge. Guardian name. Then he made a gesture I hadn't seen before, reaching out to touch my forehead lightly with his massive but surprisingly gentle hand. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent a shock of recognition through me, a visceral connection to something ancient and profound. Okalik watched with wide eyes. That's a significant gesture. From what I understand of their communication system, it indicates recognition of spiritual kinship, acknowledgement of shared ancestry or purpose. What does he mean by guardian name? Donnelly asked. Kalataka, I said quietly. My full name. It means guardian of the people in Hopi. My grandfather insisted on it, though we're only part Hopi by ancestry. Sentinel nodded emphatically and continued signing. Okalik translated. Your grandfather knew, not forgotten. Some humans remember the old agreements. A chill ran through me. Are you saying my grandfather knew about the first people? That he named me specifically because of them? The answer came with certainty. Yes. He was trusted one, spoke with first people when young, kept the secret, taught you the old stories, prepared you for this time. My mind reeled with this revelation. My grandfather had died when I was 17, taking with him the full context of the stories he had shared throughout my childhood. I had assumed his tales of forest beings were metaphorical or mythological, cultural traditions rather than literal descriptions of encounters. Yet here was Sentinel, claiming not only that my grandfather had known of their existence, but had actively prepared me to serve as a bridge between our worlds. It explained his insistence on the traditional name, his emphasis on certain stories, his encouragement of my interest in forestry and wilderness management. He never told me directly, I said, more to myself than to the others. Why wouldn't he tell me they were real? Sentinel's response came with what I interpreted as gentle understanding. Secret must be earned, not given. You needed to find your own path to the first people, to see with clear eyes, not clouded by others' truth. It made a certain sense. If my grandfather had explicitly told me about the existence of these beings, I might have dismissed it as the fanciful beliefs of an old man, or worse, felt obligated to prove their existence in ways that could have endangered them. Instead, he had planted seeds of knowledge that could germinate when I was ready, when the circumstances were right. Our meeting concluded with a new sense of purpose and clarity. The first people hadn't chosen us randomly, or merely because we happened to be in their territory. They had been watching, evaluating, waiting for the right combination of individuals who could help them navigate the existential challenges they faced in a rapidly changing world. As we hiked back to the station, I found myself reevaluating everything I thought I knew about my life's path. The seemingly random circumstances that had led me to Narration Station, my inexplicable connection to this particular wilderness area, even my choice of career, all possibly influenced by my grandfather's careful preparation for this moment. You realize what this means, Okalik said as we walked. If your grandfather knew about them, there could be others, people in indigenous communities or remote areas who have maintained awareness of the first people through generations of discreet contact. A network of human allies, Donnelly added, keeping their existence secret while helping ensure their territories remain protected. It would explain some of the consistent patterns in folklore across different cultures, Okalik continued. Not just similar descriptions of the beings themselves, but similar taboos about entering certain areas, similar offerings left at boundary markers. The implications were staggering, not just for our understanding of these specific beings, but for human history itself. How much of our development had occurred under the watchful eyes of another intelligent species? How had their presence influenced our myths, our spiritual practices, our concept of wilderness? Back at the station, I dug through my personal belongings until I found a small wooden box I had inherited from my grandfather. Inside were various keepsakes, eagle feathers, interesting stones, a few old photographs. At the bottom, wrapped in soft leather, was an object I had always assumed was merely decorative, a small carving of a tall, broad-shouldered figure with distinct non-human features. I had thought it represented a kachina or some other traditional spirit figure. Now, looking at it with new understanding, I recognized it as a remarkably accurate depiction of a being like Sentinel. My grandfather had left me a physical reminder of the truth behind his stories, waiting for the day when I would recognize what it truly represented. That night I sat alone by the lake, watching moonlight ripple across the water while turning the carving over in my hands. From the surrounding forest came occasional sounds of nocturnal wildlife, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf pack, the rustle of deer moving through underbrush. And then, from much farther away, on the ridgeline beyond Echo Valley, came the distinctive call of the first people, a powerful vocalization that carried for miles through the clear mountain air. It was answered by another call from a different direction, then another, the sounds overlapping in what I now recognized as a complex communication system rather than random animal noises. They were out there, moving through their ancient territories, discussing the day's events, perhaps even discussing us and the unprecedented relationship we were beginning to forge. I wondered how many generations of my ancestors had heard these same calls and recognized them for what they were, keeping the knowledge alive through stories and teachings, while the wider world dismissed such accounts as superstition or folklore. The responsibility I felt was enormous. The first people had chosen to trust us with their existence at a critical moment in their history. How we responded would determine not just their fate, but potentially our understanding of what it means to share this planet with another intelligent species that has observed our development from the shadows of the wilderness. As dawn approached, I reached a decision. The path forward would require careful navigation between scientific documentation and ethical protection, between controlled revelation and necessary secrecy. But I was no longer uncertain about my role in this unfolding story. My name was Kalataka, guardian of the people. And now I understood which people my grandfather had intended me to guard. The morning brought a somber development. Peterson arrived unannounced, his expression grave as he requested a private conversation away from the researchers. "There's a situation developing that you need to be aware of," he said once we were alone on the lakeshore. "The university research permit has attracted attention from some concerning parties." "What kind of attention?" I asked, though I already sensed where this was heading. "A private company called Vertex Explorations has submitted a FOIA request for all documentation related to the current research project at Nemetian Station. They're specifically interested in the unusual wildlife observations mentioned in your initial reports." My stomach tightened. What's their interest in wildlife research? Officially, they're a resource development consulting firm. Unofficially, they have connections to trophy hunting operations and exotic animal trafficking. They've been implicated in several investigations involving endangered species, though nothing's ever stuck. Peterson sighed. The concerning part is their political connections. They have enough influence to push for expanded access to wilderness areas currently under protection. The threat was clear. Somehow, word of our discoveries had leaked, perhaps through university channels, perhaps through the sheriff's department that had responded to our missing researcher incident. Now, an organization with the worst possible motives was positioning itself to exploit that information. "What's the timeline on this?" I asked. "The FOIA request is being processed. Legal says we'll have to provide the basic documentation within 2 weeks. That includes your field reports, patrol logs, and any official communications about the research project." I nodded slowly, mind racing through implications. "I understand. Thank you for the heads up." "Rivers," Peterson said carefully, "I don't know exactly what you found up here, but I've worked in these forests for 30 years, and I've heard the stories. If there's something in these mountains that needs protection from people like Vertex, now's the time to ensure that protection is in place." His meaning was clear. Whatever my personal beliefs about the First People, Peterson was offering tacit support for measures that would preserve the wilderness from exploitation. After he departed, I called an emergency meeting with Okalik and Donnelly. Their reaction to the news was as grave as I expected. "This is precisely the scenario we feared," Okalik said. "Commercial interests getting wind of something unusual before proper scientific documentation and protection can be established." "How much do they know?" Donnelly asked. "Your reports didn't specifically mention Sasquatch or hominids, did they?" "No, just unusual wildlife activity and unidentified large mammals. But combined with the university research permit and the emergency response incident, it's enough to attract attention from people looking for the next exotic trophy. We need to accelerate our documentation and protection strategy," Okalik decided. "I have contacts at the Interior Department and in several conservation organizations. With the right approach, we could secure emergency habitat protection based on endangered species considerations without immediately specifying which species. And I can work through academic channels to establish peer review protocols for our findings," Donnelly added. "Create a framework for controlled scientific assessment that prioritizes subject safety over publicity." Their professionalism was reassuring, but I knew we faced a race against time. Vertex and similar interests had resources and political connections that could override scientific concerns if sufficient economic incentives were involved. "There's something else we need to do," I said. "We need to warn the First People about this development. They trusted us with their existence. We owe them transparency about the potential threats now emerging." We arranged a meeting that very afternoon, using the communication method Sentinel had taught us, a distinctive bird call repeated in a specific pattern that carried through the forest without arousing suspicion from casual listeners. The response came quickly. Sentinel and 2 others I hadn't seen before, older members of the group, based on the silver coloring of their hair, met us in a small clearing about a mile from the station. Through Okalik's translation, I explained the situation. Unknown parties with potential harmful intent had become aware of unusual activity in the area and were seeking information and access. Sentinel's reaction displayed a sophisticated understanding of human politics and motivations. He asked detailed questions about Vertex's capabilities, their connections to government authorities, and the timeline for potential intrusion into First People territory. The older members of the group communicated among themselves in their own language, a rapid exchange of vocalizations and gestures that Okalik couldn't fully translate. Their manner suggested concern but not panic, a measured assessment of threat from beings who had survived centuries of human expansion through careful adaptation and strategic withdrawal. Finally, Sentinel shared their decision. The First People would temporarily relocate deeper into the wilderness, away from areas with established human trails or monitoring equipment. They would remove or conceal signs of their presence near Echo Valley and the cave system we had visited. Most importantly, they would alert other family groups in the region about the potential threat, activating what appeared to be a long-established warning network that spanned territories far beyond Nemesia. "They've done this before," Okalik observed as she translated their plans. "This is a practiced response to human intrusion, strategic withdrawal and information sharing across multiple groups." "Ask them how we can help," I said. "What can we do to minimize the danger?" Sentinel's answer was pragmatic. "Continue our scientific documentation but secure it thoroughly, control access to the station and surrounding areas as much as our authority permitted, and most importantly, maintain regular communication with the First People through the channels they had established." As the meeting concluded, Sentinel made a gesture I now recognized as their form of a formal agreement or pact. He placed one massive hand over his heart, then extended it toward us with fingers spread, an offering of trust combined with a request for protection. All three of us returned the gesture instinctively. In that moment, the weight of responsibility settled fully on my shoulders. This wasn't merely an exciting scientific discovery or a personal connection to my grandfather's legacy. It was a solemn commitment to protecting an entire people whose continued existence now depended partly on our actions. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a carefully orchestrated balance of official compliance and strategic omission. I submitted the required reports for the FOIA request, documenting only what was already in official records: unidentified wildlife activity, unusual vocalizations, researchers' interest in ecosystem health monitoring. Nothing that explicitly identified the presence of an undocumented hominid species. Meanwhile, Okalik and Donnelly worked tirelessly through their professional networks to lay groundwork for both scientific verification and habitat protection. They arranged for a small, carefully selected team of trusted colleagues to review their preliminary findings under strict confidentiality agreements. They initiated discussions with conservation organizations about expanded wilderness protections based on sensitive ecosystem components requiring special consideration. Throughout this period, we maintained regular contact with Sentinel and his group, updating them on developments and receiving reports of their own observations. They confirmed that other family groups had received the warning and were implementing similar concealment strategies. They also reported increased human activity along the wilderness boundaries, individuals with surveying equipment and drones that didn't match standard Forest Service or research operations. Vertex was already conducting preliminary assessments, presumably in preparation for a more formal expedition once they obtained the information they sought. The situation came to a head 18 days after Peterson's warning. I returned from a boundary patrol to find an unfamiliar vehicle parked at the station, a black SUV with tinted windows and corporate plates. Standing on my porch, engaged in conversation with Okalik and Donnelly, was a man whose expensive outdoor clothing and manicured appearance marked him as an executive rather than a field researcher. "Ah, Ranger Rivers," he called as I approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just the man I was hoping to see. Victor Mercer, Executive Director of Special Projects at Vertex Explorations." His handshake was firm but slightly damp, his manner aggressively confident. Your colleagues have been telling me about their fascinating research. Bioacoustic monitoring, environmental health indicators, all valuable data for sustainable resource management. I maintained a neutral expression. We value all scientific contributions to understanding these ecosystems, Mr. Mercer. What brings Vertex to Nemetian? Direct, I appreciate that. His smile widened. We're conducting preliminary assessments for potential resource development opportunities in the region. The university research caught our attention, particularly some unusual findings mentioned in your reports. All documented in the materials provided through the FOIA request, I replied evenly. Yes, those were helpful, if somewhat limited. A brief flash of annoyance crossed his features. I was hoping you might elaborate on the unidentified large mammals mentioned several times. Anything unusual about their behavior or characteristics? Okalik interjected before I could respond. Our formal findings will be published through peer-reviewed scientific journals, Mr. Mercer. Preliminary observations aren't suitable for public dissemination. Mercer's attention shifted to her, his expression calculating. Dr. Okalik, your background isn't actually in bioacoustics, is it? Your previous publications focus on primate evolution and isolated populations of great apes. Quite a shift to forest ecosystem monitoring. The implied threat was clear. He knew more about the true nature of their research than we had hoped. Donnelly stepped forward, his Australian accent thickening slightly as it did when he was stressed. Research scientists often apply methodologies across disciplines, mate. Evolutionary biology and ecosystem health share many analytic approaches. Perhaps you could tell us Vertex's specific interest in our work. Transparency works both ways. Mercer's facade of collegial interest hardened slightly. Very well, Vertex has received credible reports of an undocumented large mammal species in this region, one with potential scientific and commercial significance. We're prepared to invest considerable resources in documenting and perhaps preserving specimens. The euphemism wasn't lost on any of us. Preserving specimens meant killing and collecting, exactly the outcome the first people had feared from human discovery. Fascinating, I replied with deliberate blandness. The Forest Service welcomes scientific interest in our wilderness areas, provided all activities comply with federal protection regulations. Any expedition would require detailed permits, environmental impact assessments, and approval from multiple agencies. I'd be happy to provide you with the appropriate application forms. Mercer's smile became a tight line. Yes, the famous bureaucratic gauntlet. Fortunately, Vertex has excellent relationships with regulatory agencies at the highest levels. We anticipate expedited processing of our requests. He pulled a business card from his jacket and handed it to me. I'll be in the area for several days conducting preliminary surveys with my team. We have permits for drone operations and ground-level data collection. I hope we can count on your cooperation, Ranger Rivers. Within the scope of my authority, certainly, I replied carefully. After Mercer departed, we gathered in my cabin to assess this alarming development. He knows something specific, Donnelly said. That comment about primate evolution wasn't coincidental. Someone's talked. Or they've obtained information through less official channels, Okalik suggested. Corporate espionage, hacking, bribes to someone in the approval chain for our research permits. Regardless of how they know, the threat is immediate, I said. We need to warn Sentinel immediately, and we need to accelerate our protection strategy. Okalik nodded grimly. I've been working on something that might help. A colleague at Interior has proposed an emergency designation of this region as a critical habitat study area. It would temporarily restrict all commercial activities and non-essential access, while a comprehensive biological assessment is conducted. How quickly could that happen? I asked. With the right pressure, days rather than weeks. I have calls scheduled with 3 senior officials tomorrow morning. And I've prepared a preliminary scientific brief, Donnelly added. Carefully worded to establish the potential significance of our findings without explicitly identifying the species involved, enough to justify aggressive protection measures among the scientific community. I considered our options. We need to buy time. Mercer mentioned drone operations. Those could cover vast areas of wilderness quickly, potentially locating signs of the first people before they can fully implement their concealment strategies. "Can you restrict the drone permits?" Donnelly asked. "Find some regulatory reason to delay them?" I shook my head. Not without solid justification that would withstand legal challenge, but a thought occurred to me. The weather forecast calls for thunderstorms in the mountains over the next 3 days. Safety regulations prohibit drone operations during electrical storm conditions or high winds. And if the weather stations happen to report higher wind speeds or storm probability than actually occurred? O'Callaghan suggested, understanding my implication. Technical glitches happen in remote monitoring equipment, I agreed, especially during storm systems. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it might provide the critical days needed for O'Callaghan's emergency designation to take effect. Sometimes, protecting the greater good required bending rules that would allow destruction if followed blindly. That evening, we traveled to the meeting point Sentinel had established for urgent communications. The silverback arrived quickly, accompanied by a different group member, one with distinctive scarring across his chest that suggested a past encounter with human weapons. Through O'Callaghan's translation, we explained the immediate threat. Vertex had specific knowledge about a potential undiscovered species and were deploying drones and ground teams for extensive surveys. They had political connections that might override normal protective measures, and their interest was clearly in specimens rather than protection. Sentinel received this information with grim acknowledgement rather than surprise. The scarred individual, whom O'Callaghan identified by a name that translated roughly as battle scar, displayed more agitation, making emphatic gestures and vocalizations that suggested a preference for aggressive response rather than continued retreat. An intense discussion ensued between the two forest people, with Battlescar arguing forcefully for what O'Callaghan hesitantly translated as reminding humans why they fear the deep woods, while Sentinel advocated for continued strategic avoidance and alliance with supportive humans like ourselves. Eventually, Sentinel's position prevailed, though Battlescar's final gesture, a slashing motion across his throat, required no translation. If human intrusion reached a critical threshold, more direct measures would be considered. Their decision was multi-layered: immediate relocation of vulnerable group members, young, elderly, injured, to the most remote territories, deployment of scouts to track human movements, continuation of the ghost protocol, a systematic elimination of visible evidence of their presence, and maintained communication with our team for coordination purposes. As the meeting concluded, Battlescar approached me directly. Unlike Sentinel's generally gentle demeanor, this individual radiated controlled aggression. He pointed at me, then at himself, then made a gesture that O'Callaghan translated with visible discomfort. "If your kind betrays us, he will personally ensure you understand the consequences." I met his gaze steadily. "I understand. But know this: not all humans are the same, just as I recognize not all of your people share the same views. I will do everything in my power to protect your territory and your people." Battlescar held my gaze for several long moments before giving a curt nod and melting into the forest with surprising speed for such a large being. Sentinel remained briefly, communicating a final message that resonated with unexpected depth. "Your grandfather faced this choice also. He chose wisely. Now the choice comes to you." With that cryptic statement, he too disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving us to contemplate the escalating stakes of our involvement. The next 3 days unfolded in a careful dance of obstruction and preparation. As planned, the weather monitoring stations in the region began reporting anomalous wind conditions and increased storm probabilities, effectively grounding Vertex's drone operations. Meanwhile, Peterson, who had become a quiet ally without ever explicitly acknowledging the true nature of what we were protecting, implemented a series of routine trail closures and ranger patrols that effectively limited ground access to key areas. O'Callaghan and Donnelly worked tirelessly through their professional networks, building support for the emergency habitat designation while preparing scientific documentation that would withstand scrutiny without revealing more than necessary about the first people. Mercer grew increasingly frustrated with the delays, his initially polished corporate manner giving way to barely concealed threats about regulatory consequences and career implications. I maintained a rigidly professional approach, citing Forest Service protocols and safety regulations with meticulous attention to detail that gave him no actionable grounds for complaint. On the fourth day, a breakthrough. Ocalic received confirmation that the Interior Department had approved the Emergency Critical Habitat designation, effective immediately and lasting for an initial period of 120 days. All commercial permits for the region were temporarily suspended pending comprehensive biological assessment. I had the distinct pleasure of delivering this news to Mercer personally, presenting him with the official notification, while maintaining a carefully neutral expression. "This is absurd," he fumed, scanning the document. "We'll have this overturned within days. Do you have any idea the level of political influence Vertex commands?" "I'm sure your legal team will pursue all available options," I replied evenly. "In the meantime, all non-essential access to the designated areas is suspended. Your team will need to vacate the research perimeter by tomorrow at 0800. His face flushed with anger. "This isn't over, Rivers. Whatever you and your scientist friends think you're protecting, Vertex will find it. And when we do, there will be consequences for this obstruction." "Just following federal regulations, Mr. Mercer. I'm sure a company with Vertex's reputation fully supports proper environmental protections." After he stormed off, Ocalic approached from where she had been observing the exchange. "That buys us time, but not security," she said quietly. "He's right about their influence. They'll work every angle to get this designation reversed." "Then we use the time wisely," I replied. "How soon can your scientific assessment team be on site?" 3 days. I've selected researchers with the highest ethical standards and previous experience with sensitive species. They understand the protocols, documentation without disturbance, classified findings until protection frameworks are established. It was a carefully balanced approach, gathering the scientific evidence needed to justify permanent protection while minimizing the risk to the first people during the process. Not ideal, but necessary given the realities of our legal system, which required documented evidence of what we were protecting. That evening, as Vertex reluctantly packed their equipment for mandatory departure, I traveled alone to the communication point to update Sentinel on these developments. The temporary victory, the continuing threats, the carefully controlled scientific assessment to come. I found not Sentinel waiting for me, but an older female I hadn't met before. Her silver-gray hair and deeply lined face suggested considerable age, yet she moved with surprising grace as she emerged from the shadows. Around her neck hung a pendant carved from polished stone, a symbol similar to the one on the carving my grandfather had left me. Through the limited sign language I had learned, supplemented by gestures and drawings in the dirt, she communicated her identity. She was the group's keeper of memories, responsible for maintaining the oral history and traditions of the first people through generations. She had known my grandfather during his youth, when he had encountered their kind while working as a seasonal forest guide. This revelation stunned me, direct confirmation that my grandfather had indeed interacted with these beings, had been trusted with their secret, had carried that knowledge through his life while preparing me in subtle ways to eventually discover the same truth. The memory keeper shared something else. My grandfather had faced a similar situation decades earlier, when resource development interests had threatened First People territory. He had helped conceal their presence, had misdirected those seeking evidence, had chosen to protect rather than exploit his knowledge. Now, she indicated, the cycle had returned. Different humans, same threat. Different guardian, same choice. As our communication concluded, she performed a ceremony I didn't fully understand, but instinctively recognized as significant, marking my forehead with red ochre from a small pouch she carried, then placing her hands on my shoulders while making a series of vocalizations that seemed directed not at me, but at something unseen around us. When she finished, she pointed to the mountains, then to my heart, then made the sign for unity or connection, linking her fingers together in a powerful gesture that needed no translation. I was being formally acknowledged as a guardian of the First People. a role my grandfather had apparently held before me. Not a scientific observer or temporary ally, but someone bound to their welfare through generations of trust and shared purpose. The responsibility was immense, but I accepted it without hesitation. As the memory keeper disappeared into the forest, I felt a profound sense of clarity about the path forward, not just for the immediate crisis with Vertex, but for my life's work. The next 2 weeks unfolded in a carefully orchestrated ballet of scientific documentation, legal maneuvering, and continued protection of the First People's privacy. Okalik's assessment team arrived as scheduled, conducting their work with exceptional sensitivity to the ethical complexities involved. They gathered evidence of an undocumented hominid species, footprints, hair samples, vocalizations, even distant thermal imagery, while respecting the boundaries Sentinel had established. Vertex, as expected, mounted an aggressive legal and political campaign to overturn the emergency designation. They submitted formal complaints, leveraged political connections, even attempted to discredit Okalik and Donnelly's scientific credentials through background investigations and selective media leaks. But we had prepared well. The preliminary scientific evidence was compelling enough to withstand scrutiny. Conservation organizations rallied behind the habitat protection, recognizing its importance even without full disclosure of the specific species involved. Indigenous rights groups, subtly informed about the cultural significance of the area without explicit mention of the First People, added their considerable moral authority to the protection efforts. Most surprisingly, Peterson and several other veteran Forest Service personnel stepped forward with their own accounts of unexplained encounters over decades of wilderness management. Not direct confirmation of the First People, but enough corroborating evidence of something unusual to justify continued protection measures. By the end of the 3rd month, it became clear that the emergency designation would be extended and likely converted to permanent protected status. Vertex gradually reduced their active opposition, though Mercer made it clear in a final confrontational visit that they were merely redirecting their efforts rather than abandoning them. "There are other areas, other reports," he said as he prepared to depart. "Whatever you're hiding here, it can't be unique to just this location. We'll find evidence elsewhere, without your interference." His words were unsettling precisely because they contained truth. The First People weren't limited to Nemesian's territory. Their family groups extended throughout the mountain ranges of the Pacific Northwest, each facing similar pressures from human expansion and resource development. As Okalik and Donnelly's official research period concluded, we faced the question of what came next. They had accumulated enough evidence to justify continued protection without revealing the full nature of what we had discovered. Their carefully worded research papers described compelling evidence of an undocumented large mammal species of significant scientific interest, while emphasizing the ethical imperative of habitat protection over specimen collection. "I've been offered a position with the Conservation Biology Institute," Okalik told me as we walked along the lakeshore on what would be one of her final days at the station. "Leading a new program focused specifically on ethically studying potentially sensitive undocumented species." "Created with this situation in mind?" I asked. She nodded. "The Institute director knows enough to understand the significance without demanding full disclosure. It would give me resources to continue this work, not just here, but potentially in other areas where similar beings might exist." "And you, Donnelly?" The Australian grinned. "I'm joining her team, of course. Someone needs to keep her from getting too caught up in the science to remember the people behind it. Their departure would change the nature of our work with the First People, but not end it. We had established communications, built trust, created a foundation for ongoing interactions that could potentially expand over time to include other trusted humans." On their final evening at Nemesian, we held a small ceremony at the lakeshore. Sentinel and several members of his group emerged from the forest at dusk, their massive forms silhouetted against the setting sun. They brought gifts, intricately woven baskets containing forest medicines, stone tools of exquisite craftsmanship, and most precious of all, detailed maps drawn on bark showing territories, seasonal movement patterns, and potential danger areas where different groups might react with hostility to human contact. These were not merely symbolic offerings, but practical tools for continuing our work of protection and understanding. Through Okalik's now fluent translation, Sentinel explained that their council of elders had decided to formalize the relationship we had begun, not just with our specific individuals, but with the concept of respectful human connection after generations of deliberate separation. The world changes, he signed. The old ways of complete hiding no longer protect us. Some humans must know, must help, must speak for the first people when decisions are made about the lands we share. It was a profound philosophical shift, a strategic adaptation to changing environmental and political realities. Just as humans needed to adjust our understanding of what and who existed in the wilderness, the first people had recognized the necessity of limited but meaningful engagement with human society after centuries of avoidance. As the ceremony concluded, Sentinel approached me directly, placing one massive hand on my shoulder in a gesture of trust and connection. "Your grandfather would be proud," he signed. The circle continues. The guardian watches. The forest remembers. In that moment, standing between worlds, I understood more clearly than ever the responsibility I had inherited, not just to protect a physical territory or even a recently discovered species, but to preserve the possibility of connection between two intelligent peoples who had shared this continent for thousands of years without truly knowing one another. The sun sank below the mountains, casting long shadows across Lake Nemishin. From the distant ridgelines came the haunting calls of the first people, echoing between peaks as they had for countless generations before humans named these landscapes or claimed them as their own. I listened with new understanding, recognizing patterns and meanings in what had once seemed merely mysterious. They were not calls of defiance or territorial warnings, but something far more profound, reminders of ancient knowledge, affirmations of continued existence, invitations to remember that the human story was only one thread in the complex tapestry of consciousness that inhabited these mountains. As darkness fell and stars appeared above the lake, I silently renewed the promise I had made to Sentinel, to the Memory Keeper, to my grandfather's legacy, and to the wilderness itself. The first people had survived for millennia by adapting to changing conditions while maintaining their essential nature. Now they faced perhaps their greatest challenge in learning to coexist with an expanding human presence that both threatened and potentially offered protection. In this uncertain future, they would need guardians who understood both worlds, humans who recognized the profound value of preserving not just biological diversity, but the unique consciousness and culture of these ancient beings. My name was Kalataka, guardian of the people, and I had found my purpose at last. I never planned to become a ranger at Takina Wilderness Reserve in Alaska. My life in Seattle had become predictable, boring even, a corporate job that paid well but drained my soul. When I saw the posting for a seasonal ranger position in one of America's most remote parks, something deep inside me responded. Maybe it was my grandfather's stories of wilderness adventures, or maybe it was just desperation to escape the concrete and glass prison I'd built around myself. The name Takina comes from an Athabascan word meaning river of shadows. I'd later understand how fitting that name truly was. My supervisor, a weathered man named Cascay, had deep lines etched into his face like the topographical maps that covered the walls of our outpost. "Most folks don't last a season," he told me during orientation, eyes narrowed against the smoke from his pipe. "The isolation gets to them, the silence, or maybe what breaks the silence." I laughed nervously. "What breaks the silence?" He didn't answer, just handed me the keys to Cabin 7, positioned on the eastern shore of Lake Kunmut. Radio check-ins twice daily, no exceptions. The cabin was rustic but comfortable. Solar panels for basic electricity, a wood stove for heat, and a small propane refrigerator. Through the windows, I could see the lake stretching out before me, crystal clear waters reflecting the surrounding mountains. My duties seemed straightforward. Patrol designated areas, assist visitors, monitor wildlife activity, and document any unusual environmental changes. The reserve saw few tourists, mostly seasoned backpackers, and the occasional research team. During my first week, I settled into a routine. Morning patrols, afternoon documentation, evening radio check-ins. The work was peaceful, the landscape breathtaking, until I found the footprints. They appeared after a light rain in the soft mud near Broken Pine Creek, about 3 miles from my cabin. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear, but the shape was all wrong. Too large, nearly 18 inches long with 5 distinct toes. The stride length measured nearly 4 feet. Whatever left these tracks was massive and walked on 2 legs. I photographed the prints and radioed Kasky. "Probably just a bear walking funny," he said dismissively. "Or someone playing games." "In size 30 shoes," I countered. "And there's no one registered in this section of the park." Static filled the radio for several seconds before Kasky responded. "Documented in your report. I'll send Raven to check it out tomorrow." Raven was the only other ranger stationed within 20 miles of my location, an Inuit woman who'd worked the reserve for nearly a decade. She rarely spoke during our brief encounters, but carried herself with quiet confidence that I envied. That night, I couldn't rest. Wind whistled through the trees surrounding my cabin, creating whispers that almost sounded like words. I added logs to the stove, trying to dispel the unusual chill that had settled over me. Just as darkness fully claimed the landscape, a sound cut through the night, a howl that started deep and guttural before rising to something that resembled a scream. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't anything I recognized. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. Yellow eyes reflected the beam about 50 yards away, at a height that couldn't belong to any known predator in the region. When I adjusted the light, they vanished. The radio crackled. "You hear that?" Raven's voice, unusually tense. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "What was it?" "The old people call it tornate," she said softly. "The shadow walker." "What does that mean?" I asked, but the radio had gone silent. The next morning, I found deep scratch marks on the trees surrounding my cabin, 8 feet above the ground, too high for a bear. Something had circled my cabin while I slept. A week later, a group of hikers went missing. The search brought me face to face with something I couldn't explain, and couldn't escape. The lost hikers were a group of college students, 3 young men who'd ventured off-trail despite explicit warnings. Their last registered checkpoint was near Eagles Pass, about 5 miles from my cabin. I joined the search operation at dawn, along with Raven and 2 rangers from the western sector. "They probably just got turned around," said Mingan, one of the western rangers. "Happens all the time with these college kids. Too much confidence, not enough experience." Raven remained silent, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line. We split into pairs. Raven and I headed toward the dense pine forest that bordered the northern ridge. The day was unusually cold, with a fog that hung between the trees like cobwebs. "You've seen it, haven't you?" I finally asked as we crossed a small stream. "Whatever made those tracks?" Raven stopped, her expression unreadable. "My grandmother called them kushtaka. Others have different names. Most rangers who stay long enough encounter something. Bigfoot?" I said the word almost apologetically. "Names have power," she replied, "and whatever walks these woods is older than any name we've given it." By midday, we found the first sign of the missing hikers, a backpack hanging from a branch, about 10 feet off the ground. Not placed there, impaled there on a broken limb. The contents were scattered, and several items showed clear tooth marks, large, distinctly human-like teeth. "Bears don't do this," I whispered. "No," Raven agreed, "they don't." We radioed our coordinates and continued. The forest grew denser, the fog thicker. Sounds became muffled, creating an unnatural pocket of silence broken only by our breathing and footsteps. Then we found the campsite. The tent was shredded, sleeping bags dragged several yards in different directions. But it was the trees that chilled me. Dozens of stone cairns surrounded the clearing, balanced impossibly on branches and stumps. No human could have reached some of those placements without equipment. "They're markers," Raven said quietly. "For what?" "Territory warnings, My people didn't come to these woods during certain seasons. A scream echoed through the trees. Human, male, terrified. We ran toward it, crashing through underbrush until we reached another clearing. One of the students sat, huddled against a boulder, shaking violently, clothes torn and dirty. Alone. His name was Anton. His friends were gone. "It was watching us for days," he stammered as we gave him water. "We kept finding sticks arranged in patterns around our campsites. Then the sounds started, like someone mimicking voices we knew, calling from the woods." "Where are your friends?" I asked. Anton's eyes welled with tears. "It took them. Last night it was huge, taller than any man I've ever seen, covered in dark fur. The smell was like wet rot and copper." "Did you see its face?" Raven asked. He shook his head. "Just the eyes, yellow, like they were glowing. It moved so fast. Grabbed Michael first, then Jordy when he tried to run." He clutched my arm. "They screamed for so long." We got Anton back to the ranger station as quickly as possible. Search teams continued looking for the other students, but I knew, somehow I knew, they wouldn't be found. That evening, Kasky called an emergency meeting. His usual stoicism had cracked, revealing genuine concern. "We're closing the northern sector," he announced. "The official story is environmental assessment." "What's the unofficial story?" I asked. The room fell silent. Finally, an older ranger named Adahi spoke up. "Every few years it gets bold, takes people. We close areas, wait it out." "Wait what out?" I demanded. "Shouldn't we be hunting this thing?" Kasky fixed me with a hard stare. "Listen carefully. This isn't a bear or a wolf. It's not something you track and kill. The last team that tried never returned." I returned to my cabin that night with a rifle I hadn't carried before. The darkness outside my windows seemed thicker somehow, more watchful. I triple-checked the locks, built up the fire, and tried to convince myself that Bigfoot was just a legend, that the missing hikers had encountered a bear or gotten lost in the vast wilderness. But I knew better now. And whatever stalked the forests knew I knew. At 3:17 a.m., something heavy walked across my porch. The floorboards creaked under tremendous weight. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the rifle leaning against my bedside table. Outside, the footsteps paused. Something large sniffed at the doorframe, a deep, wet sound that raised the hair on my neck. I aimed the rifle at the door, hands trembling. The lock was sturdy, but it wouldn't hold against a determined predator, especially one strong enough to tear a tent to shreds. The radio on my desk suddenly crackled with static, making me flinch. Through the white noise came fragments of a voice, not Kasky or Raven, or any ranger I knew. It sounded like a broken recording, repeating the same partial phrases. "Coming through the trees," and "can't outrun." The voice on the radio wasn't coming from the station. Someone, or something, was broadcasting on our frequency. The creature outside began to circle the cabin. Its footsteps were methodical, almost deliberate. I followed the sound, moving from window to window. But the darkness outside revealed nothing except the occasional shadow passing between trees. Then came the knocking. 3 distinct taps on the west wall. Pause. 3 more taps. Not random pounding, but purposeful communication. "What do you want?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched for several long minutes. I began to wonder if it had left when something clattered onto the porch. Moving cautiously to the window, I peered out. A hiking boot lay on the wooden planks. I recognized it immediately, the same brand Anton had been wearing. But this wasn't Anton's boot. The size was different, and this one contained something dark and misshapen. I keyed the radio. "Raven, Kasky, anyone copy?" No response except more fragmented voices, whispering now. "Watches from the trees, and knows your scent." Dawn was still hours away. I built up the fire higher, creating a barrier of light and warmth. Outside, something large moved through the underbrush, circling wider now but still present. Watching, waiting. The stories I'd dismissed as folklore now seemed like warnings. The indigenous peoples of these regions had tales of creatures that walked the boundary between worlds. Not quite animal, not quite human, but ancient and intelligent, territorial, vengeful. When first light finally came, I stepped cautiously onto the porch, rifle ready. The boot was still there, but now I could see what it contained. A torn piece of map with a location marked in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The marking showed a cave system near Black Ridge, about 8 miles northwest of my position. I recognized it from the topographical maps, a largely unexplored network of tunnels that most hikers avoided due to unstable conditions. I should have radioed it in, should have waited for backup, but the frequency was still compromised, filled with those whispering fragments that now seemed to be describing my own cabin, my own movements. Whatever we were dealing with, it was listening to our communications. I packed essential supplies and headed out. The forest felt different now, watching me with malevolent awareness. Twigs snapped behind me when there was no wind. Patterns appeared in moss and stone that hadn't been there before. Arrows pointing northwest, toward the caves. It was leading me somewhere, setting a trap perhaps. But if there was any chance the missing hikers were alive, 6 miles into my journey, I found the first body. It hung suspended between 2 tall pines, intertwined in the branches as if placed there deliberately. The remains were partially mummified, much older than the recent disappearances. The victim wore the tattered remnants of a Park Service uniform, at least a decade out of date. I photographed the scene with shaking hands, then continued toward the caves. The forest grew quieter with each step, the normal sounds of birds and small mammals conspicuously absent. The cave entrance was marked with more of those impossible stone cairns, balanced stones defying gravity, forming a pathway inward. The stench emanating from the darkness made me gag. That same wet rot and copper smell Anton had described. Logic told me to turn back. Every instinct screamed danger, but I'd come this far. The beam of my flashlight revealed a tunnel sloping downward, walls lined with more balanced stones and something else. Claw marks scored the rock, some fresh enough that dust still settled beneath them. 100 yards in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My light caught reflective surfaces, dozens of them, arranged carefully on natural stone shelves. Cameras, watches, smartphones, jewelry. Hundreds of items collected over what must have been decades, and beyond them, movement. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, its massive frame silhouetted against the far wall. Matted dark fur covered its body, but its face was the true horror. Not fully animal, not fully human. Intelligent eyes reflected my light with that same yellow glow I'd seen from my cabin. It didn't charge. It watched me, head tilted in an almost curious manner. Then, deliberately, it reached one massive hand toward a shelf and selected something, a Park Service badge. My predecessors, I realized. It tossed the badge at my feet, a warning, a message. Behind the creature, I glimpsed more movement, shapes huddled in the darkness. The missing hikers, other victims. I couldn't tell, but they were alive. The standoff lasted minutes that felt like hours. Neither of us moved. Then, from somewhere deep in the cave system, came the sound of more movement, heavier, multiple sets of footsteps. There were more of them. I backed away slowly, keeping my light and rifle trained on the creature. It made no move to stop me, but its eyes never left mine. The message was clear. This time, it was letting me go. This time, it was just a warning. I radioed for emergency evacuation as soon as I cleared the cave entrance. Within hours, a full tactical team had arrived. But by then, the caves were empty. No creatures, no victims, just hundreds of personal items collected over decades, the only evidence that something had been living there at all. Tahkeena Reserve's northern sector remained closed indefinitely. Official reports cited environmental concerns. Anton's statement was buried under confidentiality agreements and psychological evaluations that questioned his reliability. I was transferred to a ranger station in Olympic National Park, hundreds of miles south. Safer, more populated. The nightmares followed me there, yellow eyes watching from the tree line, impossible stone structures appearing outside my new cabin. Sometimes on the park radio frequency, I still hear fragments of those whispered messages. And I know, with absolute certainty, that whatever walks the wilderness of Tahkeena is patient, territorial, and it remembers those who have seen it. Some nights I wake to the sound of 3 distinct knocks on my wall, Some nights I find small cairns balanced on my porch steps, and I know it's only a matter of time before we meet again.